Len, you want to start the first couple slides?
Sure, Parveen. Damon Silvers was going to start us off, and unfortunately, he had a luncheon at the White House that was going to start at 11:30, and as our morning session kept going on, he delayed it, and he conveniently delayed it to 1:30.
Well, we got to give him a little grief in the future, because I think we've heard that once before. So
I know, I've heard it more than once
We'll have
before.
to keep him honest.
Really, what I want to know is what are they serving up at the White House? So, at any rate, but Damon gave me instructions on what to say. So, Parveen, if you can flip the slide. Our charge was really to go back through the recommendations of the ACAP committee that came out in October of 2008, 8 years ago, and discuss those in the context of investors and prioritize recommendations that haven't been implemented in terms of what is thought to be most important to, would be most important to investors. I want to flip it. Just to give you some background, as Damon pointed out to me, this was considered to be a very significant undertaking and study by the Bush administration. After discussions with the auditing profession, when it was put together by Secretary Paulson, he went through a very thoughtful process in terms of picking the members. He had Paul Volcker on it, Arthur Levitt, Roger Cohen, the lead and very distinguished attorney at Sullivan and Cromwell, a number of people from the business community, Bank of America, Goldman Sachs, well-known members of audit committees, the heads of a couple of the audit firms, KPMG, Tim Flynn from, I believe that one was one of the second-tier firms, and then there was one, Galen Hansen, from one of the smaller firms. So very broad selection. On top of the 21 members, there were a number of observers. Dan Gelser from the PCAOB at the time, Bob Hurst from the FASB, David Twitty from the International Accounting Standards Board participated. A number of people from foreign regulators, as I recall, Michelle Prada came in and participated. And there were, the deliberations really got started in the fall of 2007. There was an extensive request for information from the auditing firms themselves, financial and otherwise. Some of those were fulfilled. A number of them went unanswered, if you will. There was a number of presentations in private. There was public hearings, both here in Washington, D.C., as well as out in LA, so on both coasts. Comments were solicited. There was an exposure draft with recommendations put out. The group overall decided to break into 3 groups, one on human capital, because the talent pool was considered to be significant and a big issue to audit sustainability. If you don't get the people you need, it's tough to do the job and put out the right product. Firm finances and structure was an important part. In that group, there was a very extensive discussion, debate about auditor liability and auditor liability reforms. This is actually the only major report on the auditing profession where there was not a recommendation for further reforms of auditor liability. And it was interesting, the business community representatives actually strongly supported that conclusion and finding on the panel. The investors definitely were there, but it was fascinating to see the people from the business community come and oppose further liability reform for the auditing profession in that section. And then finally, there was the section led by Damon on competition and concentration. There was views that companies, the business community wanted more selection, more choices to select from. By that point in time, we're down to the 4. They wanted more than that and wanted more options, so that section got into that. And so finally then in October 2008, out came the final recommendations. There are 21 recommendations, and it's because those are the 3 areas and that were considered important to maintaining the firms. And they came out and the report got published, if you will. And probably a shortcoming of the whole thing was there was never any mechanism that was put in place to monitor the implementation by the various groups, and this has been typically true. There's been other major reports on the profession in the past, the Cohen Commission, the Treadway Commission. There's one other that escapes my mind in between that and this one, but there was never a monitoring mechanism, although the GAO at one point in time, this might have been underneath Jeanette, did a very good evaluation and at the request, I think, of Dingle probably, that went back in and issued a good report that said, here's what's happened with those. And in fact, that report became part of the deliberations that led up to this report. There was tons of binders of information that the group went through, so I'll leave it at that. And out came the recommendations, and away we go.
Okay, thank you, Len. I think Mary, would you talk about this slide now?
Yes, thank you. I'm not going to go through each one of these to spare you all, and we are behind schedule. So what we did as a group, we looked at these recommendations and tried to pull them together and come up with what we thought were really the basic or the most important principles for investors. So these are really the things that we feel the recommendations accomplish. In the perfect world, if all of them were to be implemented, we really feel that they would add enormously to the quality of the audit, disclosure information, more clear communications, which we think are important. The 2 things I want to mention that we did spend some time talking about was the establishment of a National Research Center for Fraud. We all agree that fraud is a very serious problem that, you know, we can't really get our arms around in advance, except the PCAOB is in a wonderful position to be able to look at fraud, to study past fraud, and perhaps set up a database for others to use so that certain trends or patterns could be recognized. So this is the one thing that we pulled out of this that I wanted to mention today that we did as a group think was important to investors. And then the last thing is increasing the competency of the people working in the profession. When I first looked at this, I thought, you know, I'm not so sure it's real important that that these auditing firms are really financially strong. I don't know where that came from, but in going through this process, I realized it's critically important because they need to attract talent and they need to train people, and people need to be skilled in the work they're doing, and they need to have the funds to invest in the database and the technology that they need. So this human capital portion of these recommendations, as far as our group is concerned, is definitely of value to investors. So I'm going to move on. I'm not going to go through each one of these points. I think they're pretty self-explanatory.
Okay, so this point, what I would do, I'll talk about the next few slides, provide an update, and those of you, as Lynn mentioned, the ACAP report, which we printed and read, the whole big copy is still available on the website of the Treasury, and we wrote letters to AAA, AICPA, NASBA, SEC, and PCAOB, and we got responses from everyone, and we also did our own research in terms of figuring out what progress has been made. So what I'll do in the next few slides is summarize, that progress. And also one important point to mention, the working group did discuss what is going to be our lens in evaluating the progress made towards these recommendations. And we agreed that we are going to be looking at it from the viewpoint of, how these recommendations have helped the investor, or they have the potential to help the investing sort of a community. And then also, the progress was evaluated from the same angles, and then we came up with the 5 priorities we thought that the board may like to focus on in the near term. And then I think Norman is going to take over and talk about some of those. So as you can see, we have a fairly big report that we wrote along with everything else, and it's available for you to review. But we decided to use a color-coded scheme, and we acknowledge that people may have a disagreement. We can certainly have a big debate on it, but that's not what the intention is, that, what progress is made. So very clear, this is a scheme that most of us have seen in the boardrooms, and red means little or no meaningful progress has occurred in the opinion of the working group, and orange or yellow is some implementation has occurred, but more remains to be done, and green is that the ACAP recommendation has been acted upon with some successful results. So I will go through these relatively quickly to give you an idea and bring everyone on the same page. So recommendation, the first category was human capital, and within the human capital, the first recommendation, 1A, is talking about updating the exams and things like that, updating of the certification. CPA exam has been revised, and the new version is to be launched on April 1, 2017, and many of us in the audience know that what changes are occurring, so I will not go into those details, except that the number of hours have gone up from 14 to 16 also. The reason we have there the yellow or the orange is because significant diversity continues to exist in the 54 jurisdictions regarding requirements to sit for the exam. 1B and 1C are talking about updating the business and the accounting curriculum, and the reason for that particular color there is that there is no systematic process currently in place at the national level, either via AAA or any other organizing group, to track what changes are occurring. Are they timely? Are they the curriculum is current or not? So that's what is the status with regard to 1B and C. With regard to the 2A and 2B, which is recruiting and retaining minorities in the auditing profession, some positive movement has occurred in this direction, and we quote some data from the latest 2015 AICPA Trends Survey, just to give an idea that in 2008, at the time of ACAP's recommendations, according to that particular survey, there were 32% of the accounting students graduating were non-whites, and in 2015, the number went up to 38. And the number of new hires in the accounting field, that 28% was non-whites, and it has gone up to 31%. We could not find the data on the retention, so obviously some efforts need to be made on that side to see what kind of information is available. 2C talks about the role of the community colleges in recruiting minority. Was very difficult to get some relevant information on that. And 2D and 2E are talking about cross sabbaticals with historically black colleges and universities, and increase in the PhD programs of minority population. So there is a progress on the as a result of the PhD project, from 294 PhDs in 1994 to about 1,300 in 2015. So that's the progress on that. On the 3A supply of PhD qualified accounting faculty and professors of practice, accounting doctoral scholars program is there. AICPA and the big four firms have committed over $17 million in that particular initiative. AAA and AICPA have come up with the Pathways Commission. More emphasis is taking place on the professionally focused faculty. Cross sabbaticals, we are all aware of. The Securities and Exchange Commission has some. I have served in that role myself, and PCAOB has also started in 2009. In terms of the 3C, which is private funding for the accounting research, certainly is not happening at the large scale like the sciences. And one of the discussions in the working group was primarily perhaps some of the research that academics are conducting. The regulators, policy setters, and the practitioners may not be finding it as useful. The divide between the academic research and the what practitioners want is certainly growing, you know. In terms of moving on to the human capital recommendations, number 4 and 5 here. Number 4 deals with the demographic data, program profile data. We really don't have access to any coordinated data set there, except what the AICPA Trends Survey is giving us the information on. Number 5 certainly is satisfied in the sense that the AAA and the AICPA formed a joint commission, Pathways Commission. A lot of work has been done in that area. A lot of reports have come out, and they are all publicly available, as a matter of fact. On the concentration and competition, which is the second category, recommendation 1A is talking about public disclosure by corporations of any agreements with third parties that restrict the auditor choice. No such rule exists as of today, and we did some search to figure out in the material definitive agreements section of the reports to find out if there's any incidence of disclosure in this area, and at least I could not find anything when I did the word searches through a program to see what might be there. 1B is talking about the inclusion of representatives of smaller audit firms in the various forums, fellowships, and engagements with the AICPA, PCAOB, SEC. It's occurring. We can tell from our experience, but once again, we do not have any empirical data to really conclude whether tangible progress and sustainable progress is being made in that direction or not. On the recommendation 2A and 2B here, this one is particularly critical in the sense it talks about PCAOB's monitoring of potential sources of catastrophic risk that would threaten the audit quality. According to the response we got from the PCAOB, and as well as what we saw on the website, is the strategic plan does list something to this effect as a priority. And what's said in there is they study the business models of the firms, but we could not find any other information that would allow us to conclude what exactly has been done and what progress has been made in this area. 2B deals with the establishing a mechanism to assist in the rehabilitation of a troubled large CPA firm in case, God forbid, that were to happen. and we couldn't find a whole lot of information in that area also that what progress is made. Now remember, all of this is research based on the publicly available information sources that we have. Number 3 in this category talks about the AQIs, as we talked about a little bit in the morning also. In general, yes, efforts are underway, and lots of stuff has occurred in that area. Implementation has yet to occur in the sense of a final rule or something of that sort. In terms of 4A, single source of access for auditor independence requirements in one place. There are various places where that information is available, but again, as the ACAP intended, perhaps in one particular place, freely available information that is still not available. But yeah, that information is out there, and many commercial outfits are selling that for a fee also. 4B is talking about training to develop professional skepticism regarding independence and other conflicts. We know that progress has occurred in that area in the sense PCAOB Staff Audit Practice Alert number 10, NASBA and AICPA have several projects underway in that area. With regard to the recommendation 5, which is the ratification of auditor appointment by the shareholders, informally it is occurring quite a bit in the public space, but there is no formal rule in that area yet. Number 6 is talking about enhancing the regulatory collaboration between the board and its foreign counterparts. And yes, progress is definitely occurring in that area as we read in the news. With regard to firm structure and finance and governance, the first one is, and this actually comes out in our priorities, National Center on Fraud. And we know that the board started in this direction under Mr. Golzers in 2010, but it's still pending and did not follow through. There are initiatives, as the board reported to us, that they have for internal training, fraud cases, fraud databases there, and they have a goal to make it available to the public, and it'll be good to get some clarity on that. On the recommendation 2A, which talks about the mobility provisions, progress is being made. 49 out of 54 jurisdictions have adopted, but we are not quite at the finish line yet. 2B is talking about the regulatory roundtables. Yes, they exist. They are occurring between NASBA, PCAOB, SEC, and other regulatory bodies. 2C is talking about the greater financial and operational independence of the state boards of accountancy, and NASBA seems to be advocating quite a bit in this direction, so progress has been made. Recommendation number 3 is auditing firm governance. That comes out that we will talk shortly in our priorities also. That deals with the independent board members with full voting power and transparent disclosure of their governance controls. The feeling of the working group was that compared to the EU, we in the United States still have a long way to go in that direction. Number 4 is talking about amendments to Form 8K to appropriately characterize any premature auditor changes. There are all kinds of disclosures being made in the Form 8K, but they are still not capturing this premature partner rotation. So we believe that the progress needs to be made in that area. Number 5 is the auditor's standard reporting model. We have a separate working group on that. We'll be talking about it. And so there is a movement here. Everybody knows, so I'm not going to talk too much on that, but there is work being done in that area. Then number 6 is dealing with the engagement partner signature. Yes, working group acknowledges that through Form AP, these disclosures are being made, but the conversations occurred in the working group that it's not as easy to obtain information, and there would be additional time and cost imposed on the investors in terms of securing this information, perhaps more progress can be made in that area. Number 7 is talking about the annual report by large audit firms, something along the lines of the EU's 8th directive, and progress certainly needs to be made in that area when we are talking about what we are doing here, what's being done in Europe. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Harrison to talk about the 5 priorities of the working group that we want to bring to the attention of the board for near-term actions.
Thank you, Parveen. So as you've seen, we, in essence, divided our work and our presentation into 2 elements. The first being a review, recap, research into work that's done to date, information gathering. The portion that I'll touch off now in my remarks has to do with the advisory piece of our work and our proposal. We decided that it would be most productive to focus on a limited number of the initiatives that received either an amber or red score on our review. Those that we felt, if completed or if fully implemented, would result in the greatest benefit to the investor community. And the interesting thing was that there was a good, healthy discussion among the working group members, but at the end there was some strong consensus around the 5. Here they are, and I'll move to the next slide in a minute, but what I'll point out here is that, if I'm not mistaken, all 5 of them, or at least 4 of the 5, should be familiar to some of the longer-serving members of this group, because these are all topics that we have discussed more than once over the history of our time together, which may say something in itself. But so let's move on to the first one. First area where we would urge the board to continue and complete its work is in the area of AQIs, this goes to what we view as a fundamental issue of educating the investor community, providing them with information that they need to have a well-informed say and provide well-informed feedback to audit committees, and in cases where their shareholders are permitted to vote, to cast an educated vote as to whether or not to approve the reappointment of an auditor. That information simply doesn't exist today. And we think there's some fairly strong concern and consensus in the investor community that it would be very useful information to have. We talked during the earlier presentation about the results of the board's inspections of firms, and I take to heart the point Joe raised about selection criteria and how to read the results. But nonetheless, there are the deficiency rates, as you all well know, are in the view of some, disturbingly high. Over the 2012 to 2014 period, among the big 4 firms, the deficiency rates were between 35 and almost 40%. One of the firms had a 50% deficiency rate in 2013. Those numbers are higher for the second-tier firms, and we think that that alone provides a basis for concern about audit quality, and a strong basis for having a set of criteria or indicators that would help investors better understand the quality of the audit and the quality of the auditor performing the audit. This was, as I mentioned, this particular topic was covered here in 2013, and I think all the members of the working group are still here. I think it was Tony and Lynn, Gary, Mike, and Damon and I think were the members of the working group that recommended to the board a set of AQIs that had as their objective a focus more on the outcomes of the audit than on the process by which the audit was conducted. That, of course, was followed by the concept release, the receipt of comments. Our understanding, based on the correspondence we received from the board, is that the current plan is for there to be continuing study of this topic, and in the meantime, prior to any eventual action, encouragement of audit firms in the U.S. to develop their own and employ them on a voluntary basis. Some would say that's a polite way of saying that this initiative has run to ground, and I think the view of this group is that it deserves to be a priority, and we'd strongly urge you to keep going. Next. The Fraud Center, Parveen mentioned as well, and just briefly to recover, there was some early action here at the board to create a center. There was a listing for a position of a director, and that did not come to fruition. We are mindful of some of the work that both CEA and ORA are doing that touches on the gathering of data and dissemination of data relating to frauds, and we understand and appreciate the importance of that. But it nonetheless is the strong view of this group that the Fraud Center, the concept originally envisioned by the commission, the Paulson Commission, is a worthwhile and important effort in itself that should be undertaken independently and have a life and a body and funding and staffing of its own. And that, you know, there may be some questions or concerns about cost. We think this is a good example of a category of initiatives where the cost-benefit analysis can be difficult because the costs are probably somewhat easy to measure in quantitative terms. The potential benefits we all think are enormous and difficult to capture in financial terms. The level of information, the encouragement of research and identification of trends relating to fraud, categories of fraud among the professional firms and the investor community, we think is an initiative that deserves the board's full attention and priority. So we would strongly urge you to revisit and keep going in the area of establishing an actual fraud center as originally envisioned by the ACAP. Again, the audit report is a topic of the next panel, and we certainly don't want to step on their toes. I will simply point out here some areas in which we believe investors would obtain the greatest benefit from fuller disclosure or discussion in the audit report. One of those, as the committee recommended, was a statement and clarification of existing rules, including the board standards relating to the auditor's responsibility for fraud detection. Critical audit matters is a topic for Joe's panel, which we will discuss in a few minutes. We believe that disclosure of the auditor's tenure and the disclosure of the process and result by which the auditor confirmed its independence are important for investors to see and have an opportunity to read. And in addition, other information concerning the manner in which the audit was conducted, the results, and the risks that the audit firm identified in its application of the risk assessment process that the board's new rules now require. The fourth topic where we believe strongly that we've fallen behind here in the U.S. is on the issue or the category of transparency and governance of the large audit firms. And again, this is a topic that this group has visited in the past, and the theme here, the underlying principle here is that the audit firms obviously occupy a central position in the capital markets in our economy. There is a legislative mandate to employ them and engage their services for audit. I know a lot of us who are in the consulting or advisory business would love for there to be a legislative mandate for people to hire us, but it's us. And their status as economic entities in our economy is also a somewhat protected status, and we all believe and believe that the investor community strongly believes that in exchange for that, it is only reasonable to expect some level of disclosure about the manner in which the firms are governed and about their financial strength and sustainability that is much greater than the information that's provided today. And as I mentioned, the European EU standards concerning transparency reporting are much stronger than here in the U.S. They require detailed discussion of legal structure, governance structures of the firms, a discussion of their internal quality control systems, and a statement regarding efforts that have been made to ensure the effectiveness of those systems, including specifically an explanation of when their last quality control assessment took place and what the results of it were. and disclosures around independence practices and a confirmation that internal independence reviews have been conducted and the results of those reviews, all of which we think are critically important issues that go to the integrity of the firms, their independence, and the audit process they undertake. And I think the best that I can do here by way of example is, and it's only one, is to show you, doing a little homework for this presentation, I pulled up the copies of a 2015 transparency report for one of the big four firms. This is the US firm's report. This is the European firm's report.
On the firms.
This is their transparency report. Yeah. 9 pages, 83 pages. 22 of which in the European, and I strike that. I misspoken.
The firms are now color-coded, so you want to be careful.
Yeah. But well, I think right. There would be these are in the public domain. I think the trend would be uniform. This is actually the UK member firms report. So I want to be sure one country, 88 pages versus 9, including detailed discussion of internal control, quality control systems, the manner in which they're implemented, and statements of quality assessment reviews conducted both internally through their professional practice protocols and groups, as well as by external reviews. And so we think that the picture is worth 1,000 words there, and that we're behind, and that the, given the relative size of the capital markets and the difference in revenues between the two member firms that are at issue here and in other examples we could provide, that investors in the U.S. or investors in companies listed and audited in the U.S. Are not receiving a fraction of the information that investors in other economies are receiving with respect to the governance and risk assessment processes and financial stability of the big four firms. So those are 4 of the 5. The 5th topic that we will cover, the 5th recommendation, relates to the human capital recommendations. I'm going to turn it back over to Parveen and to Joe, I believe, on this one. This is an area that both of them have devoted a great deal of time and scholarship to. So I'm happy to turn it back over to Parveen.
Thank you, Norman. And I think this is, last but not least, important. It's a critical topic that's very near and dear to Joe and myself as educators. And although the recommendation in the ACAP report talks about upgrading the curriculum, but if you really look beneath it, what it is talking about is making sure that the human capital supply chain is fit for purpose, and it directly impacts the audit quality and hence the investor protection and capital formation. So there is a direct causality and a linkage, and it's very important. Now, what we did in this case, although the ACAP recommendation was asking for that, there should be some monitoring of the processes in place, how frequently and how critically the curriculum in accounting and business is upgraded. And as I said in my update, there is no formal mechanism in place where we can go and really do a study over a 10, 15, 20-year period to see what is happening. And there are reasons for it. And obviously, there is no one particular agency that keeps track of this thing. An American Accounting Association, is just a group of professors who contribute information on a voluntary basis, but there is no coordinated effort there. So what we went a little bit further, and Joe, feel free to chime in, we kind of identified what are the hurdles here that we see from our experience. In my role as the chair of the department for 9 years, I stepped down on June 30th, and Joe is still the chair of the department. We interact with the firms. We place our students in the auditing supply chain. So it's a little bit of our own experience also interacting with the supply chain, so to say. Lower, financial return in auditing. Basically, this is public information. What I learned by collecting this data, and Lehigh is just one example, auditing, a student is getting anywhere 55 to 58 or maybe 60 at the most starting salary. And as a matter of fact, when you look on the advisory side, the salaries are 75, 78. So when you're talking to a 23-year-old student who is really carrying a lot of debt, and the parents are saying that, honey, it's done. After that, you go and do the job. Student will come and sit in the office and rightfully argue with you that what is it that's going to motivate me to make a career in auditing as opposed to where I'm going to get money. $20,000 at that young age is a substantial sum of money. It's almost 40% of your auditing salary, you know. So that is one particular hurdle we see in the way of the supply chain, you know. The other aspect which, I used to think maybe I'm the only one who thinks, then Joe validated that after he became the chair. And this is critical. As a matter of fact, when we were putting this together, Joe said that, Parveen, if we can hit on this point, I think rest of the problems will be solved. And the point basically is lack of understanding and recognition by many in the higher administration of our universities, particularly the business deans, quite frankly, that accounting programs are very unique and they need to be treated differently than, with all due respect to finance and marketing and supply chain and human resources, etc. Because there is a public interest mandate, so to say, we have. And what is happening is when the accounting programs are being treated just the same way as everything else, there are problems in terms of upgrading curriculum because you have to go through the bureaucratic process and then you get into territorial battles, why accounting should have the higher number of credits and why not marketing. And we all know the human nature, so you start fighting those battles. And as a chair, a time comes when you say enough is enough and I'm not going to pursue this line any further. And the other is the engagement of the accounting faculty with the profession is very critical. And I think our experience is that because there is a publish or perish mentality that is forcing many of the pre-tenure faculty and even the tenured colleagues who are at the associate level to hide in their offices and just do research that is getting published in the elite journals. And whether, the practice community, the regulators, policymakers are getting informed or not, it doesn't really matter. But, I don't want to waste my time interacting with the practice folks. I just want to hide and do my work and publish in some of the journals that you may not even touch, The MS in accounting programs, I think we share a concern that it is important that the right way accounting education, the 150 credit hour implementation, perhaps should occur is through a postgraduate degree in accounting. And that was very clearly highlighted in the ACAP report in one of the dissenting opinions also. And our experience is that actually twofold in this sense. Many students are doing a checklist kind of a mentality, as in the academic circles, we would say that a number of students end up taking proverbial basket weaving courses. You get the credits and you are done, you're complete 150. So it does impact the quality of the auditing. It does impact whether we are imparting in them the skill set which is essential to audit the complex businesses today. Other thing that's happening is a lot of one-year programs are popping up for the revenue generation, and we were talking about this at the lunch table too. Universities are significantly focused on raising revenue. Everybody is feeling the crunch. And what is happening in the process is that non-undergraduate accounting students are joining these programs, and you are cramming everything into 1 year or 18 months or maybe a little bit longer. And people acknowledge in our academic circles that the pass rate for such students on the CPA exam is much lower, but they say, so what? At the end of the day, they are going to go do auditing for 2 years and move on. I think that's a cause of concern. It is really not producing fit for purpose supply chain. Lack of uniformity in the state board requirements. We came across some research. The number of credit hours varies significantly within the 54 jurisdictions. Fine, at the end of the day, everybody takes the CPA exam, and you could argue that, hey, the playing field is level there. When they take the exam, they get the certificate. And we all know that the CPA exam is short-term memory exam. It trains you for entry level. But what we are talking about here is developing mature judgment, developing professional skepticism, and ability to ask the right questions through developing that particular skill set. A couple other points here on this slide are, you may not be familiar with the idea of how the accreditation works in the accounting programs, particularly the way the dominating agency, which is the AACSB, does the accreditation is, my accounting program can design its own mission. They will come and evaluate us in light of that mission. That mission may have nothing to do with the public interest. If a lot of my students are going into public accounting, but my mission has nothing to do with the public accounting, I still get the accreditation. Obviously, there are some hooks there, but at the end of the day, it is the self-mission driven approach as opposed to the public interest mission approach that we would advocate in that sense. And then I think other concern is we don't have the analysis to support it. It is sort of our personal views here in the sense that we are seeing a lot of faculty coming into the classroom without the CPA degrees or the certification, or without even real life practical experience. And you wonder what level of engagement they will have, what level of instruction they might have. It is not to say that the people who don't have this kind of a background are not good teachers, but I think it's a joint mission between the academia and the practice, and we own it together to make sure that we are preparing students who are really fit for the purpose, and the purpose is becoming complex and complex as we are going forward. So those are some of the hurdles we see. Joe, do you want to say something on this slide?
I mean, you did a wonderful job, Harveen. I think, one of the challenges here is it's really not clear who owns this. This is one of the big problems. It's not obviously by any stretch a PCAOB issue. It's not obviously an SEC issue. So it's very hard to assign accountability for this. And the recommendations were originally made largely to AAA and NASBA. I think with the benefit of hindsight, that might have been a mistake. AAA has no power. So, for the people in the room who are not familiar with AAA, do not deceive yourself. There's no power there. NASBA, to some extent, but only through the CPA exam. And candidly, NASBA can change whatever they want, and some schools are just going to say, well, that's more responsibility for Becker. So that's not even going to move the needle that much. The only thing that probably would move the needle would be one of two things. For major employers to say, this is what we expect. If you don't have this, we're not going to hire from your institution. The problem with that is with starting salaries at $55,000, their biggest concern is not having enough people. So they don't want to start biting the hand that feeds them. The other issue that might be able to move the needle, and Parveen certainly alluded to this, is AACSB. AACSB does have the ability to change behavior because of accreditation standards that most schools care about. But it's not obvious to me that the SEC or the PCAOB, it would have to be more moral suasion. You don't really have any authority, at least not that I'm aware of, over AACSB.
I guess the only thing I would say, and what we did on the next slide is a couple of thoughts we have put down together here for some of these voluntary organizations like AAA and NASBA to consider. The only place where I would submit that the board could persuade is the firms, since you do have the direct jurisdiction over the firms, and continuously questioning them that what are you doing in order to attract the right talent, and that may perhaps lead to some of these organizations making sure that they are getting the right set of students. Yes, it is absolutely true that this is very much a market-driven problem. And what we are recommending here basically is that perhaps the American Accounting Association, of which both of us are members, may wish to commission a study in a systematic way to figure out what are the potential solutions, because the view that we have is we are all in it together. And educators have a role to play, AAA has a role to play, NASBA has a role to play, AICPA has a role to play, and then obviously board has a role to play in terms of, because all of this feeds into providing the right labor pool so that the audit quality is enhanced, and which would take us to our eventual goal of reliable financial reporting. So that's sort of the thinking of the committee, and I invite any other members of the working group to chime in and give some thoughts if you wish to share.
Michael, you seem to have an interest in reading those financial reports. We'd be more than happy. We gathered them all for the U.S. and international top 7 firms, and we've got them. We'd be happy to ask Nina to photocopy them for you and send you a copy.
Well, I appreciate that volunteerism, Lynn. But my thought and question is just along those lines was, there clearly should be some form of transparency. I actually asked Kurt, who audits the auditors? And, he said, well, they're all private, so they pretty much, audit themselves. But I would think that we could recommend or suggest some form of body, because it's not a lot of firms, especially when you look at the larger ones, the top 7 or 8, to give some better transparency on how strong they are. Especially since the public investors, depending on what they're publishing. That's one. The other point I wanted to raise, just on human capital, which I found very interesting, and I think you were spot on. I think a lot of it has to really depend on the firms who are really seeking to have the right individuals come into the auditing profession. You had a couple of comments there about dealing with historically black institutions, historically black colleges. If I can be of any help or assistance, and I know it's not one of your top 5 priorities, or maybe it is sort of thrown in there somewhere, if I can be of any help or assistance through my association with Howard University, please feel free to volunteer me for that, Lynn.
Lynn, let me ask a couple of questions too, and that is, first of all, thank you for the offering of that assistance, because I know that that's been an area of considerable concern to Jeanette and myself, and that is the outreach to the minority community, and it's a difficult and direct uphill climb. Let me make some very brief statements, and I'll get to the question that I want to ask. First of all, Marty Baumann is directly involved with commenting on the CPA exam. I don't know whether you want to say any words at all about that, but then also with respect to recruiting minorities, we have a scholarship program, which is, in Sarbanes-Oxley, and we put quite a bit of effort into the scholarship program. And Bill Graddison, a former member, of the board, was very intricately and directly involved in trying to ensure that we get a little bit more diversity than we otherwise would have in that context. And Mary, I don't know whether you'd want to say anything at all about that, nor am I asking either one of you unless you want to volunteer afterwards. AQIs, you're perfectly right. We developed 38 indicators, and we need to do more. But we have followed up on that recommendation, and we're actively pursuing it. There are 28 indicators. They are voluntary. So those are just generic remarks. A lot of what you have indicated are within the jurisdiction of the AAA, the AICPA, the NASBA. But getting to a couple of issues. First of all, for the entire time that I've been here, I've kind of hid behind the ACAP recommendations with respect to transparency, with respect to the audit reporting model, and others. They serve somewhat as my Bible, and 8 years later, we are making some progress on some of them. But I'd like to pursue with you recommendations on catastrophic risk, audited financial statements, and the annual report transparency. First of all, there's some feeling among some that these firms are either too big to fail or too few to fail. Could you talk a little bit about why some of your membership felt that there ought to be audited financial statements? What's the rationale behind that? And then also, with respect to the annual report transparency, what specific types of transparency are you looking for from the PCAOB, and how would you like to pursue that? And then, just another comment, I won't comment on a number that you've raised. Behind closed doors, we have been talking about the importance in terms of the governing bodies of the firms and the need, at least some of us have, in terms of independent board members. That's not a standard-setting activity, but there are a number of us on the board who have, directly talked about the governance of the firms and the fact that there ought to be independent board members on there. Because if you are, in effect, at least with respect to the largest firms, a top 200 firm in the United States, maybe you ought to apply by some of the same governance standards as a Fortune 500 or a Fortune 200 company. But why don't you talk a little bit about the recommendation on catastrophic risk, audited financial statements, and what you'd like to see with respect to the greater transparency. And then, Marty, if you want to talk at all about what you've been working on the CPA exams. And Mary, if you want to talk at all, which I'm not asking you, but if you want to, on a scholarship program, just to enlighten what we've been doing. But Lynn, why don't you take it away?
Well, let me echo your thoughts, Michael. Thank you. The diversity issue, I'd be remiss if I didn't say that Bess Jaffe from TIA CREF, who couldn't be here with us today, she's out of London, and she's due in the foreseeable future, so her doctor wouldn't let her get on the airplane. But she felt very strongly about diversity, so I think I owe it to her that she felt that was very important, and a very important part that the governance of the firms should be looking at. I actually went out and looked at the data. The data is much improved from when I was in school. I mentioned that to my wife, who's a dentist, and she reminded me that there were 3 women in her class of about 78. And she said, progress isn't enough. We need to make more today. And I think that's true. In fact, it was somewhat discouraging. I thought in the last year or two, we as a profession had moved in the wrong direction, backwards on diversity, and I would hope we would continue. So I think your point is well taken. Hope the board will take you up on that offer. As far as transparency and governance, let me take it in 2 pieces. First piece is the transparency piece. On the ACAP committee, during the to start off with, we sent a letter to the profession. People on the committee met with the profession. In that, we asked for specific financial information, data, that would allow us to take a look at the firms. That was precipitated by the fact that the firms were arguing that any one particular case could cause them to fail. And so we wanted to say, okay, what's the liquidity, what's the funding, what's the capital, and is that true or not? And the firms refused to present us that data. They gave us limited data, though, that did raise a concern, because it appeared that if you recorded a liability for all their post-retirement benefits, that there could be one, maybe possibly two of the firms that would actually have negative equity, at least at the time. But they were unwilling to provide that data, and parts of that is the way they operate as a partnership, and they tend to distribute 90% of the earnings each year out to the partners, because the partners want the money to be able to pay taxes on the income. So then we started to, since we couldn't get really the data to do that, then we started to look at other things. We had a presentation made by someone who helps defend the firms, and that showed that on the litigation payouts, the payouts on average were around half a penny on every dollar of claim. So they really, the settlements that they were actually paying out in cash weren't that significant. In fact, the largest payouts had nothing to do with audits. It had to do with consulting and tax services. There were some big ones on audits, don't get me wrong. But we found that. And so then we started to ask in the public hearings. We went through and asked, for the record, each of the CEOs of the firms, or their representative testifying, what financial information they had that they were providing the partners at the time. None of the big four were providing a GAAP basis set of financial statements to their partners. None of those, of course, well, if you aren't providing GAAP basis financial statements, they aren't going to be audited GAAP basis financial statements. So that was off the, and that was triggered by the fact that in the UK at the time, they were requiring those top 7 or so firms to have audited financial statements. And they did have them over there, and they were made available to the public on their website, but we didn't have that here. And so if you didn't have the GAAP basis set of financials, they hadn't even prepared them, then it gave rise to this concern, well, how can you monitor that from a public policy perspective so we don't get into a too big to fail possibility? Because the firms were saying we had this catastrophic risk. We got beyond that somewhat because, and that's why this report didn't have any recommendation for tort reform, because it appeared that the catastrophic risk wasn't being due to the actual settlements on the large audit cases, perhaps other reasons, but given that, then we had a great discussion. Okay, if that's the case, we don't want to get into a too big to fail. Then what do we want to have? Because we didn't have anything in the U.S. So we looked to what the European Union was doing at the time with their 8th directive or 40th directive, whatever it is, their directive, okay? And started looking at that and thought that was a good starting point. And in fact, some of the accountants on the group actually said the same thing. That's a good starting point, get something in place. Chairman Doty has been very good at least moving the ball, if you will. Not always where I'd move the ball, but he gets things done. And so along those similar lines, the notion was, well, let's try to at least start in the middle with the 8th European Union directive and get that information. And then once we get that, then people can decide where we go from there. There were people on the committee who would have gone to where the UK had gone. The UK was much ahead of Europe at that point in time, because the UK was saying we wanted audited, full GAAP basis audited financial statements, which were great. The UK was at the top, kudos to them, then Europe, and then the US. What we what we see as we go through these is they don't provide you the US ones, because that's what we're talking about, the US firm. They don't provide you with sufficient financial information to make an assessment about stability, sustainability. They don't give you the information on the balance sheet, and we certainly don't have the information on these huge no, you just don't have that in these reports. And I think if you look on average, as Norm pointed out, the European do have more data on the firm in all aspects in terms of governance, and in fact in some, well, I'll come back to that, but just more on governance, what the firm is doing, the finances. So overall, it's just a much thorough report. So I would turn around and saying, you know, these firms are the only people you have to hire for an IPO or for an offering of securities. You don't have to hire an attorney. You don't have to hire an underwriter. These are the one person mandated by law. So they've got a very important federally mandated utility, and with that should come some obligations, especially since we're just down to 4. So I think going back, while I'd prefer the UK approach, because I thought that was great, I think even getting us to where the European was, which is what the ACAP recommended, I think that's where, to Steve's question, we need to get. I would have hoped that by this point in time it would have been done voluntarily. There was some discussion with representatives of the profession on the ACAP that they would move in that direction to do it voluntarily. It just hasn't happened. We're 8 years out. People have short memories. I remember when Arthur Andersen, after the scandals in the 70s, early 80s, Arthur Andersen put on an advisory board, and memories got short, time passed, and that advisory board went the way of the dinosaurs. So I think unless the PCAOB does something here, we're going to be the same place we are the next time we have an Andersen, whenever that does occur, and it's likely to occur, I think. So that's the issue on transparency. On governance, when you look through the reports again, the governance of the firms, for the most part, is much the same it was when I was a partner. I assume when Pete was a partner as, yeah, yeah. So it just, the governance structure hasn't changed, and it does impact the culture of the firms. The people at the very top, the CEO, is elected by the partners. And then there's a board of partners, a select group of partners that form the governing board for the partnership. And they direct it, but they're all internal, they're all internally focused. None of them have that independent perspective that we look for in public companies. Because of the unique structure of these things, all being LLPs or LLCs, on ACAP, we didn't say, here's how you got to set up that structure. But what we said is, go study that structure and then come up with something. That's, in essence, where we were going with it, because we hadn't, in the year we had to do this all, we only had 1 year, we couldn't go beyond that because of the federal laws. We said, go ahead and study it, figure out the best way to do it, and then put that in place. Now, again, to their credit, in Europe and in the UK, especially the UK, where I noticed they have put together what they call, I think, a public interest member, and they have so many independent, you know, the firm is actually picking that person, so you got to take it with a grain of salt, okay? The firm leadership, which is picking that thing, we don't have an independent nominating committee like we have with boards here now, but at least it's a step in the right direction to get that public interest member on there. They've gone to that. We don't have that. We're still back to the same governance structure we had in this industry when I came into it 40 years ago. And when you think of the magnitude of the changes of public company corporate structure over that 40 years, to think in the accounting profession we're still the same place we were 4 decades ago is almost mind-boggling. Yeah, almost scary. And I think what concerns people is when you don't have that outside perspective, people don't always think about that public interest obligation. We're certainly seeing that, and we don't see the type of culture. And when you look at the compensation structure, which plays into this, ultimately at the end of the day, the ultimate compensation structure is really set by those people in that governing board and the person or lady at the top. And the good news is we got some women at the top of these things, so maybe things will get better. But that compensation runs down hill, if you will, and so the guy at the top or the lady at the top are really setting the compensation for those key partners, and they're probably not going to challenge that person, because if they do, that's going to have a negative impact. And so you get into this very much silo mentality and mindset rather than being able to think of out of the box. And that was discussed in this group and agreed by just about everyone in the committee that we needed to get modern corporate style governance, independent thinking into that. And if we can get that, get better governance, get better transparency so people can measure. We're very concerned that if you aren't even getting the data, the risk of too big to fail is humongous. And so if you look at these recommendations, a bunch of them, or not a bunch, but some, they don't say go get audited financial statements. They say, you know, let's start with the European directive and go get that type of stuff, and then we'll see what comes next. And so my perspective is I just go back. I would just like to see what we can get in terms of ACAP. We aren't there. We're 8 years down the road. If we haven't even got there in 8 years, I'd like to see us, while I'd go further, I'd like to see us just be able to get there. If we can't get there, there is no question, without a doubt, we do face catastrophic risk. And there's been arguments on the board about whether or not they have the ability to look at financial stability. But if you look at the Supreme Court case that this organization went through a number of years ago where their constitutionality was challenged, and you look at the Supreme Court decision, the Supreme Court decision in and of itself says that SOX gave this board the ability to legislate. I think the actual language is something like legislate everything about the public accounting profession. You know, I don't think there's anything in the legislation that would preclude the board from getting enough financial data that they can monitor financial risk and the possibility of another Anderson.
Marty, do you want to talk briefly about what we did on the CPA exam, and then very briefly, Mary, if you want to talk about the scholarship and our outreach? And then Lou, you've dealt with our international counterparts. Maybe you can say 2 words on our cooperation and coordination with our international counterparts.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Glad to do that. We had looked at the CPA exam in the past when the AICPA was making changes to it, but we took this recommendation of yours in ACAP here very, very seriously in the past year, or the last couple of years, when the AICPA was going through a study to make changes, and said that the role of the PCAOB is to ensure high-quality audits. And to do that, we need high-quality CPAs. And so we took a much greater involvement in this particular change that took place in the new CPA exam that's being rolled out, as was mentioned in 2017. And it wasn't just me. I was an active participant with some of my staff on the task force from start to finish, but our comments that we shared with the board and got board input from that in terms of getting getting new input into the CPA exam. So some of the improvements that were made in the new CPA exam reflected things that we were seeing as problems in our inspection process. So we emphasized more technical matters such as an auditor's ability, new CPA's ability to audit complex accounting estimates, to audit fair value measures, to audit internal control of a financial reporting, and greater emphasis was put on that in the new CPA exam. We also talked to the task force about, and the task force was very responsive to make the changes we wanted. The exam now has less memorization and enhanced testing of higher order cognitive skills. Some of these include things like critical thinking, problem solving, analytical ability, professional skepticism, writing skills, the ability to take a problem, analyze it, and write a good conclusion about that. So I think the test is much more focused on not just memorizing what you learned, but applying all of that in a work environment. So I think the exam made progress. We took an active part in it, and we think it's an improvement, and I think they're going to make improvements going forward. As was mentioned, the exam also increased from 14 to 16 hours. So we took involvement, and I think it was good steps, and I think they made good progress on it.
Mary, very briefly.
Very briefly. Just a couple of points. One that was on slide 26 talked about the scholarship fund awarding the fines only to students who are in advanced degree programs. And just to point out that the scholarship program as it stands right now, and the board can make changes to it if they wish, divides the numbers of recipients into a group of 75% and a group of 25%. The 75% represent the schools with the highest, granting the highest number of master's degrees. So 75% of the schools that we select are in that group, and the selection is random and done by an outside provider. The other 25% is the balance of the schools, which is where the vast majority of the schools exist. One other thing that I wanted to mention is that we do in the program encourage diversity. It's not required. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act basically says that the awards should be merit awards, and we have not defined what merit is. We've left that up to the various deans of the accounting schools to determine what merit should be from school to school. We did do one very informal survey of recipients from last year's recipients, and we discovered that the recipients reflected the general population of the USA as a whole. But I would greatly appreciate any help that we could get, particularly from you, Mike. Thanks very much for volunteering. And
Mary, you want to mention the amount and the number of scholarships?
oh my gosh, total over the years. I'm not sure I've got the total amount. I can tell you that the largest number of awards that we offered that we granted in a year was 102, and at $10,000 award, an award. That's 1,200,000, or 2,000 rather. I think starting with our first year, and I think our first year, correct me if I am wrong, was 2008, 2009. And we started with a much lower amount because our fines had only accumulated
Only
to a
just
certain
started.
amount, right? And I think we had 45 recipients that year, and it's been down a little bit this past year.
The thing I was wondering, Mary, do you track how many? I'm sorry. Do you track how many go into public accounting of these recipients, and how many go otherwise?
The program encourages them all to go into public accounting. We have not tracked that, and we have talked about this and talked about how we could best track this, and I know that we're still considering how to do this. So any advice that we could receive, we'd be happy to listen.
No restrictions on the funds? So do you
No. I
You
mean,
have to
there-
commit 2 years, the public accounting, or you?
No, there's
you
no,
have to
there's no
refund the
restriction
money?
like that. The only restriction really on the use of funds is that it's used to serve the purpose of the degree. In other words, they can't use it to take a trip to Europe.
Mary, that wouldn't really be very difficult to track if you wanted it. I mean, you could just make it as a requirement to the school that receives the reward, that at the end of the year, they have to report back to you where that student is going to work. Because if it's certainly in a master's program, most credible master's programs have close to 100% placement. So like
Right.
out of our master's program, I'm sure this is true for you as well, Pauline, we know exactly where every one of those people is going to work.
We could certainly talk about that with the board, and it would be nice to think that we could follow up on that and also track retention.
Yeah, I think you can always go to the chairs. They collect this data because it is in their own interest to collect this information to boast about the statistics outside. Yeah.
And one of the one of the issues you brought up in terms of the ACAP recommendations was collaboration with our international counterparts. And so Lou was the chairman of IFER, and now he's the chair of the GPPC working group. And then the chairman, I think, is on the monitoring group, but he also has entered into innumerable bilateral arrangements. So maybe Lou, you go first, and Mr. Chairman, if you want to talk a little bit about the bilateral relations that we've had with respect to our international counterparts, that'll give you some flavor in terms of what we're doing with respect to that recommendation.
Yeah, and this is an area where I think we've had as much, or sort of quite dramatic increase in our area of activity, the international outreach, and I'll talk briefly about IFER. IFER is an organization that started in 2006 and now has 55 members from countries around the world in every continent, basically. Every major industrial, or most of the major industrialized countries are members of it. China and India are not yet. India primarily because it doesn't have an independent audit regulator that we're satisfied exists. China because of just complicated relations. One of the things that it has allowed, that IFER has allowed us to do, though, is to both assess the quality of auditing around the world. And I think one of the things we've learned both through a survey that IFER has prepared now for 5 years running, which basically is a global survey of audit quality, is that whatever problems we have with audit quality in the United States, particularly in the developing world and the emerging countries world, our problems are dwarfed by the problems of audit quality in those countries. So we spend a lot of time in IFER with the leadership of the global Big Six networks. And one of the things that's interesting about this organization is that because you'll have 10 major countries, representatives of 10 major countries sitting around a table, I think we get a level of attention from the very senior leadership of the global audit networks that you really don't get, that no single regulator, including the PCAOB, gets. And so we have been working very closely with them to try to understand better what they're doing to improve audit quality, what kinds of impediments there are, what kinds of controls that the global leadership has, what are their abilities to impose audit quality worldwide? What are the impediments, structural, cultural, other kinds of things to do this? We've set a goal, for example, with respect to the survey that we do every year, that we want to see a 25% increase, or decrease, I should say, 25% decrease in the number of audit findings that regulators around the world find from these Big Six firms over the next 4 years. It's the first time that we've ever given a quantitative goal for this. So the international cooperation has, I think, given us an opportunity to see the profession from a different light than I think any individual regulator gets. And as a result of that, we also learn by interacting with people, we also learn about a lot of the new governance things that are happening around the world, new kinds of auditing reports, new oversight techniques, new cooperative techniques. So it's been, I think, very much a learning experience for us, and I think for, frankly, our counterparts around the world.
We inspect in over 40 foreign jurisdictions. We have bilateral arrangements, statements of protocol with 27. We inspect now and have these bilateral arrangements in every European country except for Belgium. And that represents, I'm including in that, agreements in Ireland, in Greece, and in Italy, which have been achieved this year. The significance of Europe is that we now have an extension of the adequacy determination, which means that we will be able to continue to inspect in Europe merely with renewal of the statements of protocol bilaterally. We do not have to achieve a separate determination at the EU level, at the Commission level, of the adequacy of our inspection regime until 2022. So this is a significant extension of our ability to operate bilaterally in Europe, and we continue to seek arrangements in other countries such as the Republic of China. But these statements of protocol are modeled on the SEC's MOUs, which are also extensive and which provide for information sharing and confidentiality. The joint inspections have yielded tremendous ability to look at the global network firm audit in a new light. It informs, for example, our proposed rule on the supervision of other audit firms in the global audit.
Steve, if you will, for a moment, back to the scholarship thing, I think it's phenomenal, especially in a day and age when these universities cost 20 to 50 grand a year, and you're talking about 5-6 years of school, so a student facing a phenomenal amount of cost and facing a high amount of debt when they come out. I think the fact that you guys are providing $1 million, perhaps $1 million plus, to help fund those educations, hopefully to people from all walks of life, is just phenomenal, and I give you my hand for that.
Congress wants it.
Yeah. Parveen, let me ask you just a final question on this overall topic, and we discussed this a little bit last night, but it's one thing that it's certainly of concern to me, and I think to the other board members as well, and that is with the rise in advisory and consulting services and the attractiveness and the resulting salary differential between what your graduating students are getting to go into advisory and consulting, how do we make the audit more attractive to your students, and what do we do to ensure that more capable, the most capable, competent people go into auditing? So could you talk just a little bit about how you envision the future of the audit and where we're going from here?
In terms of the future of the audit, as we spoke last night, certainly a lot is going to change, and when I talk to the firms and interact with the professionals there, there is no doubt the technology is being incorporated in the audit to a larger extent, and a number of tasks which are currently or were previously being done by the humans, so to say, are being converted into some sort of technology. And last night, as at the dinner table, we were talking about the example of blockchain and things like that. So all of that change is certainly going to impact the audit considerably. Maybe some of the change is good because many times the errors and omissions do occur on the part of the humans, and sometimes we are the weak links in the entire value chain. So it's good in that sense. The question regarding how do you make the audit more attractive is an excellent question, and it is sad that as an educator, I confront that question many times from the students, and you're trying to help them understand the role of the audit in the larger capital markets, but a 23-year-old sometimes doesn't get it when you're seeing a salary differential. So the simple answer is, if there is a financial reward, that would certainly make it more attractive to the students. To give you just a simple example of my own son, who is finishing up his fellowship in robotic surgery, he is 33 years old, not yet settled. He's looking for a job right now, and he's going to start being an attending on July 1. So one day I just asked him, I said, if you had to do this all over again, would you still do it? He said, Dad, of course, I love it. I know that I'm still making $55,000 only as a fellow, but every morning I get up and I'm excited about it. I think that is the key part, that how can we make our students think like that, that I know that it may not be as glamorous as advising or advisory services maybe, and the students do gravitate towards that. I think maybe I've always thought, how come somebody at the AICPA and other state societies haven't come up with some sort of a marketing campaign that would glamorize the accounting profession, and we will break out of this image. But financial rewards certainly go to a large extent. Now, as Joe talked about, some of these things are not within the control of the folks at this table, but I think the way board could influence is continuously asking the firms that what mechanisms they are putting in place to make sure that you are attracting the best and the brightest, at least from the pool that is coming into the colleges, into the accounting side.
Steve, if I could use my co-chair here, let me just chime in. Back in 2000, we had that same question put to us as we did the auditor independence rules, and we did a study of it. And what we found was engineers and other professions paid substantially more, and students gyrated to that. 2-3 years ago, McKinsey & Co. did a fabulous study into teachers and what it takes to attract teachers, and it was important to us on our pension fund that we understand that, and I looked at it then. McKinsey talked about in their study how ultimately the driver of where students go to work and what fields they go into, one has to do with their ability to get into that field, but then two, that's driven by compensation. So the brightest minds go where they can earn and have the best compensation. Starts with the medical and the law professions, goes on down to engineering and accounting. We're well below that. Our accounting model, which is more of a triangle type situation, not like a law firm where they have a lot of paraprofessionals, we will probably have to adjust that business model, because we do not, despite what people say, we do not attract the brightest people into the profession these days. They go into the other fields. They're going to go into engineering, medical science, law. And until we change that pyramid model and get it to where we can pay higher compensation, substantially higher than the $55,000 that Joe or Parveen mentioned, we will not. It's just a matter of economics. We will not attract the best and the brightest.
Thanks, Lynn and Parveen, for a great presentation. And there was obviously a lot of work behind this. I saw the package where you wrote letters to the various organizations and then everything they wrote back. I'm wondering if you are going to transmit this to those organizations and make yourselves available, if they have questions about your assessment and some of the analysis behind that.
I think Lynn just volunteered me. That's okay, but I have no problem.
I think that would be excellent, because it's for some of these issues, it's, well, who owns the problem? And if we're going to get any accountability or action in some of these really important issues, I think it's important to push a little bit.
I think having that on your website is a good starting point. How, yeah, we can follow.
That'd be terrific. And we can always use our bully pulpit here as well.
Damon, we're going to resist the temptation to ask you how your lunch went, but Lynn did indicate that you had a meeting across the street, and he indicated it might be in a White House, but we'll recognize you for other purposes and disclose the content of what you were doing and your great escape.
Well, they forced this dessert on me in the Navy mess that slowed me down a little bit. I wanted to, and I apologize for being absent for part of this report, which I was supposed to contribute to. I wanted to comment on how these things interact. And thinking back on our work on the ACAP that Lynn talked about, which was, and I don't know if he said this or not in my absence, but it was really a very unusual exercise of this type. And I've been involved in a lot of these types of exercises. And this one had all the right players at the table with a real desire to get to substantive answers that a consensus could support. And in that work, right, there was human capital, which we have just been discussing, and there was competitiveness, which I was responsible for, and we've just had this conversation this morning about essentially the dwindling relevance of the substance that auditors look at, the GAAP financials. And I think it's important that the board understand how these things are connected. That it is very difficult to get competitive compensation levels or competitive professional challenges in an environment which is not, in where there isn't a clear sense of, a strong sense either of public-spirited mission or competitiveness that drives the kinds of economics that draw people, as Lynn was saying. The ACAP recommendations were designed to look at a profession where there was real concern about these issues, now some years ago, and put forward a set of integrated recommendations that would lead to a more competitive, more public-spirited auditing profession that then could attract the kinds of people we've just been discussing. I think what this morning's conversation shows us is that that in an environment where, in court depositions and the like, we see leaders in the audit profession saying that really they view their mission as entirely focused on management as the client, where issues like fraud prevention are not their job. And whether this is an accurate description of their responsibilities is not relevant. It's what they perceive them to be, and against an environment in which the competition issues have not been resolved, right? And where, if anything, they are more severe than they were when we did this ACAP report. You can see a circumstance in which the relevance and attractiveness of auditing as a profession is inevitably going to be diminished, either because there aren't the competitive dynamics and the demands for excellence that would derive from the audit function being seen as absolutely critical to the people who are paying for it, nor has its standing as a kind of quasi-public service exercise that draws people for the same reason that people say are drawn to serve at the PCAOB or at the SEC. That hasn't been rebuilt sufficiently, I think. I think it's pretty clear now that has not been rebuilt sufficiently in the aftermath of not just the scandals that gave rise to this body, to the PCAOB, but I think more tellingly in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, which is something I've spoken to many times in front of this body. We are seeing this week a repetition of this in relation to Wells Fargo. Right? We've got multiple United States senators signing letters asking where were the auditors. That dynamic and the failure, which I do not ascribe to the leadership of the PCAOB, I ascribe it elsewhere. The failure to hold the auditing profession accountable and the firms accountable for what happened in these circumstances doesn't produce an environment in which anybody thinks this is a public-spirited thing to do, nor does it produce an environment in which firms, in which issuers, preparers, see that they really need to pay top dollar to make sure they don't have a problem. Right? That is the integrated story here. It's completely tied to what we were talking about this morning. I give great credit to the PCAOB and to its chair to try to in trying to do something about this. I don't mean to be. I really want to be clear. This is not an indictment of this board. It's an indictment of the larger political forces that this board is functioning within. The fact that we're having this conversation is the most positive sign out there. The fact that this body exists, that you've encouraged us to pursue this conversation, that is, I feel, an incredibly positive thing. But I think we need to understand the nature of the challenge we're facing, the nature of the problem, and the way in which it's integrated. It's not a human capital problem in isolation. It's not a problem of companies doing, making up their own numbers, which was this morning's discussion, in isolation. Right? It's not a problem of lack of competition in public company auditing in isolation. These things are one problem. And I hope the board is able to take out of this meeting sort of that understanding, and that'll help guide, what you try to, guide you as you try to address these things, which you have been trying to.
Wes?
I appreciate the dialogue, the work of the working group on this issue. As I said in the letter to Lynn and Parveen, certainly enjoyed the dialogue that we had throughout the course of the preparation work, as Chair White also mentioned this morning. I do think it's important to take stock of the ACAP recommendations and then also reflect on the number of changes that have occurred since then. And so to that end, and certainly reflecting on the importance of these topics, I look forward to continuing dialogue, just as the PCAOB, I'm sure, does as well.
Okay, and now, rather than take a break, I think, sure. And then we will not take a break. Joe, we're going to go directly to you, so we do end up on time. And then people who want to take a break can have the refreshments after they leave, or take them during the course of a brilliant presentation, but we'll just go right the way through.
So many pointed out that compensation was a driving factor. So compensation, of course, derives from value. And so value is going to derive from the role and relevance of the audit to the capital markets. Many today have said that auditing still has to improve in terms of the quality of auditing. So consistent, high-quality audits will be more relevant to the capital markets, draw greater pay. But beyond that, the new audit report, for instance, in terms of the auditor now talking about critical audit matters and the most sensitive things and the most subjective, complex things in the audit, will make the audit more relevant and a greater role of that audit in the capital markets. That's already evident from the United Kingdom. We're hearing already from the firms and from the FRC that the auditors are way more engaged and staff are way more engaged in the audit, because they're not just ticking and tying. What they're doing is going to be communicated to the stakeholders, to the shareholders in the audit report. That should make their role more relevant, the audit more relevant. And beyond that, and Damon mentioned this morning's discussion, what drives the capital markets? Yes, the financial statements are critical, but these other types of things, non-GAAP measures, KPIs, periodic reporting, what should the role of the auditor be in the future with respect to these things that drive the capital markets? That'll be critical to the role and relevance of the audit, therefore critical to getting the high-quality people into the profession.
And Joe, that leaves us to to your working group presentation.
I think at this point Joe was going to hand over to me to do some of the talking. Joe, is that that's the plan? Right, great. You can click.
You want me to click? That sounds good.
Okay, thank you. So, let's get the, nice. So I'm going to try and, the other way, I think.
Yeah.
Great.
There we go.
Thank you. So we're going to keep quite a brief presentation, and hopefully that will allow plenty of time for discussion still at this stage in the afternoon. So we were asked to report as a working group on the proposals about the auditor's report. So the PCAOB, just to recap, re-proposed in May a standard, the auditor's report on an audit of financial statements when the auditor expresses an unqualified opinion. And that was an original proposal back in 2013. It's been re-proposed. And as a working group, we submitted a comment letter to that back in August. And I'm going to briefly go through a lot of what we covered in our comment letter then. So, to summarise the proposals, the proposed auditing standard. The intention was to enhance the form and content of the report to make it more relevant and informative to investors and other financial statement users, and include a description of critical audit matters, and that's matters communicated to the audit committee or required to be communicated that relates to accounts or disclosures that are material to the financial statements and involved especially challenging subjective or complex auditor judgments. There were also some additional improvements to the auditor's report proposed. And we haven't touched on those in detail, but obviously we can discuss those afterwards, and also a requirement to disclose auditors' tenure. Given the relatively late stage in this project, as a working group, we felt it best to focus both our comment letter and this presentation today on the issue of critical audit matters. So the proposed rule requirements, summarised here. The proposal requires the audit report identify critical audit matters, describe why the auditor reviewed this issue, the principal considerations there, and indicate how the auditor addressed these critical audit matters and refer to the relevant line items and disclosures. So that's a very brief summary there, just a recap for everyone. So the working group very much supports this proposal. We believe that the proposed auditing standard does represent a meaningful improvement from the current standard audit report. And if I refer to the mission to protect the interests of investors and further the public interest in the preparation of informative, accurate and independent audit reports, it seems to me that clearly reports as intended as in the proposed standard would be more informative. To me, that seems very clear-cut, and I think the working group were quite unanimous in agreeing that point. So we think it's very much clear that this would be more informative and therefore very consistent with the mission of the board. We take no exceptions we've put here. We don't disagree with any of the 4 points that were mentioned on the previous slide. We think those requirements for the critical audit matters would be helpful. One point that we really want to emphasise here is the requirement that the disclosed critical audit matters, the discussion should be, to be most useful, must be highly bespoke to the company. If it becomes standard boilerplate language, that is not going to be helpful to investors. We certainly believe that there will be a direct correlation between how specific that information is and how valuable it will be to the users. Just to elaborate here a bit on this UK experience, which has been referred to quite a bit already today, in this matter, we've had somewhat similar requirements in the UK now for 3 years. So for most companies listed on the London Stock Exchange, we've had 3 years of these extended audit reports, including a discussion, not quite identical wording, but very similar intent, the risks of material misstatement that we've had. I think certainly my experience as a user of accounts, and for many of the investors I've spoken to, we've undoubtedly found the additional information useful in the auditor's report, and where it's been very highly bespoke to the company, we found it very useful, typically. As I mentioned this morning now, it's one of the first things I look at. I'll pick up an annual report and go and look at the auditor's report, and that is very different from the past. So it's straight away you go and look at that. So we said that we strongly support the proposal, but we do ask or request here perhaps the board to consider the possibility of doing a little bit more. So one thing the board has not done is require a discussion of what the auditor found when it addressed that critical audit matter. And what were the results? The procedures, simply a disclosure of the findings. That is not required. Now, this is a matter where we understand requiring that information could clearly be problematic. We understand that. And incidentally, it's not required. There are other international developments here. It's not required in the IAASB standard. And in fact, the existing UK Financial Reporting Council standard does not require the disclosure of findings. We understand that at this late stage in the project, that could be very difficult. Mandating that disclosure may not be feasible. However, we would like to ask the board to consider the possibility of modifying the proposal with an additional sentence that we've put here, just to state that the inclusion of informative company-specific findings could be considered best practice in auditor reporting, and that could be encouraged, although it's not required in the auditing standard. Certainly, we view specific findings would undoubtedly make audit reports more informative, and that would be consistent with the board's mission. So to give a little bit of justification for this argument, a few things on the slide here. We do regard the disclosure of critical audit matters as undoubtedly useful, but incomplete without going that step further to talk about findings. A survey by KPMG found approximately 80% of investors argued that they should include findings, that would be helpful. And the UK Financial Reporting Council is in a review of the experience of the new auditor's report requirements that investors clearly valued. The additional insight offered by extended audit reporting, and certainly investors have been particularly find it helpful whether that's included findings. So although in the UK there hasn't been a requirement to include findings, that has occurred in some cases. And if we move on, talk about that. Thank you. And just to illustrate a little bit of how well received this has been in the UK, and we mention here the IMA, the Investment Management Association, is now sponsoring an annual award for the best auditor reports. You wouldn't have had that in the past. And an example of one that the IMA recommended is the KPMG Rolls-Royce audit report. And for any of you who are not familiar with this report in the room, I thoroughly recommend it. It's a fascinating example of how an audit report can give so much more information. And as the IMA said there, provided a real value add. And one of the things that that audit report included was findings as to whether management's judgments were balanced, or in the words of the KPMG auditor, mildly optimistic or mildly pessimistic. So giving a steer as to where in the range those judgments came. And that is something that investors, many investors that I've spoken to, really appreciated. There has been discussion in the UK and there's been an evolution over the 3 years. So in the first year, there was quite a lot of boilerplate information that was not so helpful. There was then a discussion about amongst investors and the firms as to what was useful, and certainly some of the firms now, the 3 of the 4 big firms, have included findings in some of their reports. So there has been a big development over the 3 years of evolving sort of best practice. To come back to the point about company-specific information, it's really helpful to get proper information specific to the audit, and to, for example, not just have a statement of something that is obvious anyway from the fact that it was an unmodified audit report. So, for example, it's not helpful if the firm keeps repeating that something was within an acceptable range. That's not what we mean by findings. It has to be something that's new information. Clearly we need to get sort of a set of differentiated reports. Having the same standard sort of report for everything doesn't help us. We want to get new information and find out exactly something that's relevant to understanding the critical audit matters for that audit, for that company. We've got a quote there from KPMG. What are the arguments against doing this? I find this quite hard in a way, because to me it's so clear-cut that including critical audit matters is important, and that ideally findings would be very helpful investors. So the first point, I guess, is that this is moving and exceeding the auditor's mandate. Yes, perhaps that could be argued, but in my view it's so clearly an improvement that I think the fact that it's such a significant improvement should outweigh that argument. I'm certainly told that some, particularly in the audit committee community, are questioning what investors do with this information. Well, I'm quite disappointed in a way with that comment. And certainly if you look to the UK experience, many investors in UK companies support disclosure, support the new information, they found it helpful. And there are plenty of examples, and I'm happy to answer afterwards if people want a couple of sort of more specific points on the kind of thing we've learned and where it's been helpful. But I don't really feel, I think that's a question to ask investors. Now, the third point I do have some sympathy with. I think it's a working group we did that potentially the concluding findings exposes auditors to incremental legal liability. And, you know, I'm obviously well aware the legal environment in the US is different from that in other countries where there have been such developments. So it is something that we understand. What we've put here is to say that we think the fact of encouraging disclosing findings leaves it then a choice for the audit firm to weigh up the benefit of a better report against that possible cost argument in terms of legal liability. And we also, in our comment letter, mentioned potentially supporting a legal safe harbor specific to this findings point, if that was included. So to conclude, we do clearly, I want to reiterate the fact that we support the proposal as a working group. I think there is strong investor support I think the international precedents are very encouraging. And although we've had this information in the UK for 3 years, but it's coming now across Europe next year, so we have more to look forward to in Europe. We do think the proposal, however, could be strengthened if it could be encouraged to include findings. And so if it's possible to go a little further, as we've suggested here, that would be greatly appreciated, I believe, by many investors.
Joe?
Tremendous job by Sarah, as I knew it would be. Just, maybe 3 things to emphasize very briefly that I think are certainly consonant with what we had up there. The first would be if we end up in a regime, regardless of findings, where the CAMs either initially or over time become essentially boilerplate, don't do it. So if you're not willing, PCAOB and SEC, to inspect and enforce, don't do it. Because what will happen is even if audit fees don't go up, people's time is the most valuable thing they have in their life, maybe short of their family. And these reports now will be longer. There is a cost of reading this stuff. And so if it doesn't say anything, it's actually value destroying. The second thing that I would say is I think the evidence out of the United Kingdom, 3 years of data, is that it's clear, I think it's overwhelmingly clear, that investors find specific findings highly valuable. I don't know how, you might be able to argue against this for other reasons, but I don't think you can argue against that it's valuable. I think the evidence is overwhelming that it's valuable. So then the question is, if it's valuable and you're not requiring it, you're only suggesting it's best practice, there has to, I think, be a very compelling argument for why you wouldn't suggest this is best practice, when clearly the evidence would seem to suggest that it is. And then I think the third thing that's important to understand is around the legal liability issue. I remember when this issue was teed up, and Marty and others remember this, and there was a series of roundtables, there was a series of focus groups, and I remember at one point corralling some investor people, including some of the people in the room today. And I said, is this a disguised attempt to get at the auditor's wallet? It's just a kind of a crafty way to grab for the wallet. And they swore up and down that it wasn't. And when Sarah and I went to them and said, would you support a limited legal safe harbor, which I understand is complicated. You can't do it. Probably the SEC may not even be able to do it. I'm not sure. It may involve Congress. But at least in terms of the investor folks, to a person, at least the ones we talked to, were very much willing to say, if we get this information, at least as it relates to this information, not everything else, but this information, findings, we would be very supportive of a legal safe harbor. So this is not some backdoor way to try to increase legal liability for accounting firms.
Jay?
Well, thanks to the working group for the work you've done on this. It's a good discussion to have today. I want to pick up on something that Sarah said and Joe as well about the value. And Sarah and I talked just briefly last night about this, but I'd like to hear more from the other investors in the room that might be invested in UK stocks or at least evaluating, with some examples of how the information translates into value. And what I think about in this way, and I want to be educated on this to see if I'm thinking wrong, the value to me could be a new area to explore more deeply in terms of the analysis, or it might be information that wasn't known from something else in the publicly available filing information. And how maybe that new information translated into something different in the analysis, maybe a change in the model, change in the assumptions, change in the discount rate or the multiple, which ultimately affected the decision itself, and then ultimately does that manifest itself in changes in the price or volume and observable in the marketplace. And so I just kind of like to hear some examples of that, how the good information translates into something actionable, and what's been done, or maybe if these aren't the list of things I should be thinking about, maybe things that you do consider, how you translate that into value.
Jan? And I was gonna ask pretty much the exact same question, since you led with your chin and volunteered, and that is, where has it been helpful? And if you could give us more examples.
Yeah.
So first, if you answer Jay's, and then give us some examples as to
Oh,
exactly
yes,
how
I'm
it's
happy
been
to give
helpful.
some examples. So I think it's an area where just the specific nuggets, I'll give you a couple of specific examples. So one quite small one, but I think it was quite telling. So a company with a big pension exposure, and had always been using, or had been using a pension discount rate that looked higher than norms. And the auditor's report actually talked about that being a critical audit matter, or a key audit, a risk material misstatement, and actually talked about how the company calculated the discount rate, and that they were adding on an arbitrary amount on top of the normally calculated discount rate, apparently for, I think it was to do with the risk in there. So they were adding on an amount to the discount rate, and that was bringing a higher than average discount rate. And this had got through. Apparently the amount involved was not so big as to make the overall financial statements misleading, but it was an item that the auditor commented on. And then that was something that clearly a lot of investors pick up pension deficit numbers in their valuations of companies, that could then be picked up on and discussed as to why that company was taking that approach. And funnily enough, the following year, still an important area, still an area that the auditor discussed, but the discount rate had become a little more normal, within the normal range, and that comment had been dropped. And I'm sure that plenty of investors had gone to the company and asked about that calculation of the discount rate and why this additional amount had been added on, or at least that's my guess. So that may be a misperception, but that's how it seemed to me. Another example, so, and this is a little unfair, but so for example, if you took one of the very big retailers in the UK 3 years ago, the issue of supplier income wasn't really discussed in the financial statements. If you look at the auditor's report, that did flag up as a critical audit matter, supplier income. Not really discussed elsewhere. Well, I won't name the company, but there was subsequently an issue in that area. And of course, then it does beg the question of why the auditors were raising it as a critical audit matter and then not talking to the company about getting better disclosure around that topic. But nevertheless, it had been flagged up. It was a point that investors were warned about as a potential risk of material misstatement. So that actually was flagging up a very important issue. So those are, a couple of areas where sort of I've observed there's been particularly useful information, and there are many others. And I don't know if anyone else in the room who's looked at UK stocks has any other suggestions to contribute. And also just to come back to the famous KPMG example with Rolls-Royce, I think if you talk about the stock, a lot of those questions that were raised there, have been really debated amongst investors. It's important to understand these risks. There's actually, for those of you who haven't seen it, several pages of discussion, and some quite important matters, I think, have come out through there. A discussion, of risks around controls in one division and so forth. And those are really of interest to investors, and I've been in many meetings where those points have been discussed.
Linda?
Thank you, Steve. I think just to add to Sarah's point, in South Africa, we use international standards on auditing, and obviously the equivalent ISA standard hasn't become effective yet, ISA 701, but very many listed companies have already pushed their auditors, or their auditors started insisting on early adopting it. So we've seen quite a couple of those audit reports as well. And the one other aspect or benefit, Jay, maybe just adding on to your question, that I've certainly seen is it keeps the audit committees honest as well, because what's happening now, and we don't have the requirement that you have in the UK that the audit committees must have sort of reflect or mirror some of the disclosure. As you know, that's not an ISA requirement. But what audit committees now do is, in their reporting or in the financial statements, they sort of take a proactive step to knowing what will be the key audit matters, to explain further what the governance processes are around that. So I think automatically, if you look at the key audit matters and at the audit committee reporting, there is just firstly better governance, but also better disclosure for investors to give a more holistic picture of those specific areas.
And one other point, if I could just add, I think the very fact of having the auditor talking about these areas makes it very helpful as a user of accounts to engage with the company, because it gives you a hook of information. And also, if the company doesn't want to talk about it, it's much easier when you can say, but your auditor has identified this as a risk. So rather than sort of, why are you asking about that, to be able to say the auditors are talking about this makes it harder for a company to close down and not want to talk about the issue. You're informed. You're a more informed investor or analyst.
Sarah, in the UK, how would you say it's influenced the behavior of the auditor?
This is, it's a little harder to say as a user of the accounts rather than an auditor, but I think it's clearly promoted interest in what investors think and feel, because we have now more of a dialogue. I mean, certainly since these have been out there, it's been easier to engage with audit firms and point them to where it's been helpful, you know. And I think it's incredibly important for the audit firms to see this as an opportunity, because they are able to actually show the value to investors of all their knowledge. So in the past, up until now, auditors had all this masses of information, but we had, as users of the accounts, absolutely no sight of that. They're actually able to prove their value a lot more, and I think that's incredibly important when there is quite a lot of skepticism, at least amongst investors I speak to often, about the value of the audit to them. So in terms of has it changed behavior, I'm sure it has, but we don't get a great deal of insight into that. But certainly if I was an auditor and I knew I was going to be talking about this, I think it puts maybe, I would guess, a little extra pressure to be confident of what you're saying. Sharpens accountability. That's the best. Yeah, exactly. So I think, I'm sure it has changed behaviour. It's certainly prompted some useful dialogue between investors and the audit firms in the UK. So I really see it as a positive. And there is sort of been a bit of competition amongst the audit firms to be perceived to be being helpful here and to actually improve the standard, which has been very constructive, I think.
Sarah, just to clarify, as an investor, you're dialoguing directly with the auditors about what's in the audit report?
Just to clarify, not typically specifically on companies, but on overall what we found helpful. Yes, the audit firms have been quite open to having conversations. And in those cases, you know, investors are maybe bringing examples. Obviously, there's confidentiality that they are not going to give away to us, obviously, inappropriate information. But certainly company examples have come up in those conversations of what's been particularly helpful.
And Steve,
And
let
best
me add,
practice.
I'm sorry.
Sorry.
Let me add one thing in following up what Sarah said about the effect on auditors. As you know, I'm sure you're in contact with the folks at the FRC and Merrick Grabowski and those folks, and they have done quite a bit on measuring what's changed inside audit firms. And we alluded to this earlier. One of the unintended consequences, in this case a good unintended consequences, is the staff are more engaged in their work, they're more excited about their work, they feel like what they do every day actually matters more because they see the fruits of their labor in a report that people will read, other than a 3-paragraph report, as Sarah said, I think, earlier, and others have said, that people typically in the past didn't even read.
Mike, and we'll just go around. I'm sorry, well, wait a second. Jeanette, let's recognize the board first.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks for this. And I'm wondering, Sarah, can you elaborate a bit more on the very specific issue of company-specific findings? And I can kind of see this going in 2 different directions. And so if you have examples of both, that would be helpful. So in one case, you know, maybe it's a difficult audit area and the auditor finds that there's just a whole lot of uncertainty, and there's nothing really that anybody does about it. And what kind of, have you seen examples of that? Whereas in other cases, maybe the auditor found that something needed to be refined or a disclosure needed to be expanded. Management did that. You know, how far do they go in discussing the findings? They say, you know, this was difficult, and as a result of our work, management expanded its disclosure, or do they, you know, or do they say, talk about the inadequacies first of the initial disclosure and then the subsequent changes? So anyway, examples on both types of findings and results, if you have any.
Yes, I mean, I guess to caveat this a little bit, clearly most of the auditor's reports yet do not include findings. The majority do not. It's very much a minority yet. And those findings, again, vary enormously from the very, very detailed examples we have at Rolls-Royce, which I'm sure you've seen, right through to some of the less helpful, you know, blander, not very company specific. There was, you know, it was within a reasonable range type comment that doesn't really help us. So This is based on not a huge number. But yes, we have seen cases where, for example, it's been commented that errors were found, but those were then corrected. And after an error had been corrected, then the auditor was happy. But that was an insight, again, that was new. Whereas in other areas, there is a lot of just sort of, this is the work we did, and this is a risk area without either no finding or no very specific finding, other than that there wasn't, anything that required. Well, they didn't say that, but there was clearly nothing that kind of further that seemed to be required at that point. If you look at most of the findings, the PwC ones tend to just be of it was within a reasonable range and there we left it sort of thing. If you look at some of the others, one thing actually would comment that I found quite helpful, at least in terms of presentation, was what I liked about this most recent year's reports from Ernst & Young, from EY, had the column, this is what we reported to the audit committee. Now, having said that, some of those comments then below that are quite bland, and you think, well, that must have been a boring meeting, you didn't tell them much, but at least I like that way of framing it, that then here as a result, this is what we presented and talked to the audit committee about. I don't know how much that answers your question, but it is still relatively early days, at least for findings.
Mike?
Because I was on this committee, I have the insights, and this is a topic that, again, I was very passionate about. But the first comment on findings and results that I wanted to emphasize, we as maybe auditors or accountants ourselves automatically go to a finding must be an exception, versus a finding can be, they did a great job in this area, and we applaud or agree with management's judgments. Now, you're not going to see that kind of wording in this kind of report, but it should be balanced about positives and potentially negatives if there are some, without assuming it's all going to be negative. I correlate what I think the value is here. I think all of us would agree when you're doing what I'll call a service center type audit, where you're actually auditing and saying what the state should be, what your results were, if there was any exceptions, can it be relied on, and then that type of audit, which kind of relates to where we went on the broker dealers with the 17A. This isn't going there, but this is going that direction. You're trying to get more color on that, the audit process, and what the results of the audit process would be. And that starts moving you down, well, did it work the way you intended during the period, not just as of a point in time? I guess the last thing to me is I'm big on transparency. Everything we're talking about that could be including findings or results are being discussed in the audit committee meetings by management, by the auditors, with the audit committee members, and at times at the full board. So this is not something that's not already being done privately. It's just giving the investors or the shareholders or stakeholders transparency or insight to it. So those are my thoughts, my top of mind.
Arvind?
Sarah and Joe, I guess what I was wondering, maybe you covered this point and I missed it as I stepped out for a few minutes. For the first couple of years, certainly expanded disclosures in the audit report and the information that we are talking about would be new information and useful. Was there any conversation in your working group that what discipline can be put around the fact that maybe after 2, 3, 4 years, it could become a boilerplate report? And if so, how do we handle that? Because when you go in this direction, you want to make sure that you mandate something that's going to be useful to the capital markets for the longer term rather than just a couple of years, and then the excitement kind of dies down, and it's the same report like we've seen the risk disclosures in the 10K in the US at least.
Yeah, I'll give some thoughts, Parveen, and then obviously I want to hear what Sarah has to say and what she has seen. But to me, let's say a company, ABC, has 6 critical areas and actually presents findings in, years 1, 2, 3, 4, and so forth. The real important information is going to be change. And if you don't, if all you end up getting is it's the same 6 every year and it's the same wording every year, then essentially what you're saying is absolutely nothing changed inside that company on those 6 areas. That's just not believable. So if that's the case, what it's suggesting is that there's not that kind of disclosure around change. And that would be a problem if that was the case.
Yeah, I mean, this question's been sort of talked about quite a lot in the UK. Is there a danger of this? Now, we've had it 3 years. Is it just going to come? And in fact, actually, so far that hasn't happened because I think the process has been evolving so much anyway that things have changed and moved on. Yeah. But certainly one of the examples of sort of best practice, which some of the firms are doing, at least some of the time, is to talk about exactly that, where things have changed. So, for example, if something was a key risk last year and it isn't in there now, to give some explanation of what's changed. Sometimes it's obvious, that division was sold, so we're not worried about it anymore, but other times it's not. And also where new risks have evolved. And even again, and I hate having to always give the same sort of example of best practice, but if you look at how, the Rolls-Royce, the most recent auditor's report, actually gives a little chart of sort of where things have moved. So this risk is actually a bit bigger this year, or, a bit more of a concern this year versus a previous year, and this one has sort of moved down the track a bit. So not just which ones have come on and which ones have dropped off, but actually the evolution of we're a bit more worried about this and we're a bit less worried about this now, which is, again, very useful, and I think as an indicator of the quality of what the auditor is doing is quite an interesting one. Which ones are actually talking about, those kind of processes that they're thinking through, that this has become more important. Whereas exactly, if an auditor's report is just, and so far we haven't had it that much, the same as last year's and the same as the year before's, then I think you start worrying, do you really believe that nothing has changed, or is that simply the auditor not doing a great job? So again, it's helpful insight into the quality of the auditor, potentially. And it's still, again, early days, but I think that will be interesting as we go further down this track. So I think, yes, of course, I understand there is that risk there. And absolutely, to Joe's point, if this just becomes boilerplate language and doesn't tell us anything specific and so forth, it's hopeless. And it is just more pages for no purpose, and that's not what we want. But actually, I think enough does move on. And if it's really the auditors going for best practice and helping the investors understand evolution of risks, that's helpful, and that's actually a useful history then of how things have moved on. There was a problem, of internal controls last year in this division. Has that improved this year? And has it just improved so much that this is no longer a risk, or is it, just evolving, or is it actually still a worry, or even worse? So I think there's a lot we can learn from that, so long as the process is done well.
Robert?
Robert Tarola. I find this quite ironic that there's resistance to this in the auditing profession because as I'm listening to all the analysis, this could be the solution to a couple of the problems we talked about today. It appears to me it will raise the value of the work of the auditor to their ultimate customer. It would provide the transparency that folks believe is important in reporting to outside parties for an issuer. It should make the profession more exciting, that you would want to join. In fact, the way I think about an auditor, it's just the front end of the analysis process. It's the same person on each end. The auditor is a front-end analyst, and the investor rep is the back-end analyst. They have to have the same skills, the same insights, the same knowledge of the company and business models and how they all work. The public accounting profession really needs a makeover in terms of its marketing. And this may be the impetus for a makeover.
Well, being an audit committee chair and an auditor and somebody who's well-versed in the profession, those are very interesting comments.
Well, I was going to start.
You've worn so many different hats that it's interesting.
Well, when I wear a preparer hat or an audit chair hat, it's a bit scary, to be frank, because you're really now, your scorecard is going to be made public as a preparer and as a governance committee of the company. So that's a bit scary. I think on the auditor's side, I'm sure they're nervous about added liability, and I think Joe's idea is a really good one. Maybe a safe harbor for audit committees too.
Only for you, Bob.
Linda?
Thank you. Just two comments, if I may, and it's more from our experience where we debated this as the advisory group of the IAASB. Jeanette, the comment or the question you asked about the entity-specific information just triggered the thought in my mind, and there were lots of discussions at that point in time really to try and avoid industry disclosure. And I think that is a really important point that must come through. And Sarah, you spoke about, sometimes the entity-specific information might be a little bit more bland and the range is a little bit more general. But there was, especially at the initial stages of the debate, the real concern that instead of auditors drilling into the specific critical audit matters or key audit matters within the entity, to rather sort of talk about industry-specific, this is in the platinum industry and the market is distressed, and that sort of becomes a critical audit matter, because that information would certainly not be useful at all. And I think it's very important that the wording must be tight enough to avoid that sort of general disclosure, critical areas for the industry as a whole versus that company specifically. The other point that came through very clearly as well, and Mike, when you spoke, it reminded me, was that a lot of the people around the table at that advisory group felt very strongly that they're not really interested in audit procedures. They sort of want to know what the issue was and what the finding is. They couldn't really care all that much what the auditor did to get the comfort that he needed, but more sort of what the ultimate outcome or finding is. And I think there is a risk that if auditors start disclosing a lot of procedures, it will again become really boring reports that people won't read.
Yeah.
Kurt, I think you had your card up next.
Thanks, Steve. So like Bob, I think this has a lot of opportunity for the whole audit profession, and from an assurance standpoint, I think it's a potentially a very good product. I have a couple questions though that I'm just curious in terms of how the working group thought about. So first, if there are no findings or they're boilerplate type answers, does that create a false sense of assurance? Related to that, do the critical audit matters create kind of a piecemeal opinion approach with respect to the report on the financial statements, otherwise taken as a whole? How do you think about materiality and disclosure requirements around that? And then last, as it relates to internal controls, right now we have a criteria, at least as I understand it, that obviously if you have material control weaknesses, they need to be disclosed and talked about. Significant deficiencies, obviously talked about with the audit committee and kind of resolved. So does this change that standard? So does this kind of enforce significant deficiencies to be publicly disclosed as a critical audit matter? Or how do you then kind of say, no, you don't have to talk about that, but it's a significant matter? Thanks.
Yeah, I'll start off, but again, I certainly want to hear what Sarah has to say. Kurt, these are, as I would expect, excellent issues to raise. On the first, if there's no findings or if the findings are boilerplate, does that give you a false sense of assurance? And I think if the board decided to do what we're suggesting that they might, which is to encourage findings but not require them, I think the reality is inside the United States, and we recognize this, that, at least initially, there's probably not going to be a whole lot of findings. I mean, we're not finding a whole lot of findings right now in the United Kingdom. So I don't think there's going to be a global conclusion about an issuer if there aren't findings. Now, maybe down the road, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, but let's worry about that 10 years from now. On the second issue, the piecemeal opinion, certainly this is a concern that's been expressed. It doesn't appear to me, but I want to hear what Sarah has to say, to have been a problem in the United Kingdom. I think the marginal investor in most stocks today is pretty sophisticated. And I think they're going to understand that it's not a piecemeal opinion. But I want to hear Sarah's explanation or experience in the United Kingdom. The significant deficiencies is maybe not a fair thing to throw to her, because I don't believe there's reporting on internal control over financial reporting in the United Kingdom. This is not something we talked about, Kurt. I know it's a major concern of issuers and of audit committees and of auditors. So it's a fair point, and I think it would have to be looked at further. I think not to move forward in encouraging findings because of that, I think that can be solved, even if that's scoped out. That's not a strong enough reason not to do it.
Okay, just to add to that, is there a risk with this sort of piecemeal opinion? I just don't think that's been perceived as a problem in practice over the 3 years. We understand, or at least the professional investors I speak to understand the overall audit opinion, and then this is additional helpful information. And I just don't perceive it's a problem. I think, was there also a question about materiality that we didn't cover there?
Yes, I mean, if you're going to talk kind of on a piecemeal basis or call that out, I mean, how does materiality kind of play into that, especially as you have a critical audit matter? How did it affect your materiality assessments?
Do you want to go comment?
Again, that didn't come up, Kurt. We didn't even talk about that. I'd have to think about it more, but it's a fair point.
I guess that does also just make me want to add one point, which is one area where the UK has also gone further is actually requiring disclosure about materiality and the calculation of materiality. And I know that that has sort of fallen by the wayside a bit here, but I personally, I found it really interesting. And I actually, if I was to put my finger on where I think practice has most been affected or things appear to have changed most as a result of extending the required information in the auditor's report, I'd actually looked at that because first year we had a lot of outliers taking pretty high percentage of pre-tax profit. That's been changing.
Judge, you're not allowed to put your card down.
No, the only thing that I listened now for this whole day, and I was thinking, what are we talking about?
Judge, hit your mic.
What we're talking about is what you need to do in this profession, as it's been done in the legal profession, medical profession, it's branding. If an organization has a brand that it's known that you don't get their name on it unless you've done the greatest job in the world. I mean, you don't get a Sullivan and Crumble's name on a report unless they believe it's the right thing to do. Not the client. Sullivan, Trumbull won't put their name on something. The Cravath, Wachtell and Lipton. It's a branding. You got to get a brand that says this accounting firm. You're not going to get that name on that accounting firm unless it's the report that we want to go out. You won't get a Wells Fargo your name on Wells Fargo unless it's right, and they know. I mean, how do these people know? They can read the report and they can know something's right or something's wrong. They could ask the right questions. Why is it? You never see them getting into the kinds of problems that some of the accounting firms are getting into. Is it trying to get minimum standards or is it trying to get the best standards? I mean, you see the commercial. People go to BDO if they got a problem. I don't know whether it means that they're the best, but what I'm saying is that you want to brand your organization that nobody gets my name unless it's the way we want it, not the way the client wants it. You can't buy our name. I don't know if that means anything, but I'll tell you that's what I see here.
Thank you. And then Lynn?
What do you want?
A couple things. As one of the people in the room that's actually written critical audit matter memos at the completion of an audit, having to identify those. I think it's going to take some time, just based on this conversation, for the investor community to really understand. There'll probably have to be some education, because some of these CAMs do stay the same year to year. They do not change in companies, especially industry specific. So to expect things to see change time to time to time, that's probably, maybe some cases that will occur, but it's certainly not going to occur in all. So as I listened to that discussion earlier, it tells me there's going to have to be some education of the investor community, and they're still going to have to do their homework. In fact, your earlier conversation led me to believe that probably going to need to be a lot of education of the investor community if that's what the expectation was. The second thing is on findings. I actually think better than the Rolls-Royce report in this case is the Dutch report on Aegon. I think it's an excellent report because it does get into the findings and does, I think, a very good job of coming back. I forget which board member asked about the value associated with the stuff, but the Aegon report to me laid out more of the information I'd want to know with respect to the risk in the company and where some of the things were going and what the auditors did to address those. So I thought that was a pretty good disclosure. But then with respect to your notion of a legal safe harbor, I find that to be most disturbing, because you've turned around and told me this is such critical information, I need to become informed, and it needs to be very good and really telling me what the auditor thinks. But on the other hand, if they mislead me, I can't hold them accountable. So I would vehemently oppose any safe harbor. I would rather not have the CAMs than to have the CAMs with the safe harbor. I think, as we've seen in the past with some of the things, when you provide those legal protections, the accountability goes away and the quality goes down. So I think the safe harbor is a disaster in waiting.
Tony?
Thank you. I actually wanted to address that last point that Lynn was making, and I really do think that the safe harbor would be a disaster. But I also at the same time believe that, very strongly again, that saying such and such disclosure or something is encouraged is also a very big problem. For a very simple reason. I served on a committee that helped write the International Accounting Standard on cash flow statements, and very narrowly lost the fight to get the direct method. And the IASC chair at that point, David Cairns, told me that he agreed with me there should be direct method. He says, but he was hoping to accomplish it by encouraging. And if you look at both the US GAAP on cash flow statements and the international, they both start with the same thing in the first paragraph. The direct method is better. You are encouraged. But the problem is when you go to the glossary of terms, encouraged is defined as you don't have to do this. And that's the definition people are using. They're not looking at it in terms of what the language tells you. So using encouraged, I think, is a problem. I think Lynn is also right that it may take us a while as investors to learn that some of these CAMs are going to stick around, and there is a reason for them to stick around. But I have two responses to that. One is that I am willing to learn. I would like to find out, but I'm also tired of the kind of boilerplate information that I see. I'll give you an example. A few years ago, I had found a company that in its footnotes said, what its footnotes were saying was that the basket of currencies that they operated in were weakening against the dollar. But when I turned to the stockholders' equity, where they have the cumulative adjustment, that change suggested the opposite. And I couldn't reconcile those two, so I finally called the CFO, and he said, I'll figure it out and get back to you. And he called me back to say that he was disappointed that I didn't understand something that simple. He says, we've just simply had that disclosure for the last 10 years. We like it, and that's why it's sitting in there. Which I think was his way of saying, sorry, we missed something. But the point is that these boilerplate terms, these kinds of things, they get into the disclosures, and they don't go out. So there is a danger when something sticks around for too long. But I would very, very strongly suggest not to have anything that's encouraged.
Well, Joe and Sarah, thank you very much. That was, I think your comment letter is self-explanatory, speaks for itself, and we very much appreciate your having gotten it to us in the timely fashion that you did. Now, with respect to the conclusion, I've asked everybody to give a little bit of thought to any recommendations or suggestions for future topics or issues or recommendations to the board. I don't know whether or not people have them, but Mary, starting with you, I'd like to go right the way around the room, and we'll conclude with topics that you think ought to be on the agenda for our next meeting.
Well, I looked at some of the topics that we had a choice for this meeting, and I think revenue recognition is one that I think is coming up. And I also think valuations. How are we valuing companies? I don't know if these are PCAOB issues, but I do believe that these have become issues for investors. And I would recommend that we take a look at either one of those.
Joe?
Maybe a more global one, Steve. We were talking about the inspection deficiency rate this morning, and even if we say, okay, well, let's just look at those audits where there's a heightened risk of problems, which is what you try to inspect. Those are the audits you try to look at. And the inspection deficiency rates, whether they're 20 or 25 or 30 or 35, or whatever they are, they still, I think, strike most people as high. And the board's been around for 15 years. So then the question, I think it's a fair question to ask, is, are you just getting a lot better at identifying where problems are? Or are you raising the bar? Or is meaningfully improving quality, even where it's most difficult to get right, in the hardest areas? Why are we not moving that more? And what is the real challenges inside the financial reporting process, auditors, audit committees, issuers, that are preventing that? I have my own bias. I actually think in many cases auditing is better than we deserve given the institutional arrangements. I think the one weakness in Sarbanes-Oxley is that audit committees have tremendous responsibility, and for every good person like Bob Tarola, there's someone on the other side who isn't. And the accountability, the SEC does what they can, but I think there's an issue with accountability there. And it's very hard for auditors, I think, to hit on every cylinder if they're fighting management and fighting the audit committee at the same time. I think, at a certain point, you have to be realistic what you expect, too.
Thank you. Sarah?
And I suspect I'm new to the group, this has been discussed in the past, but something that I feel sort of over the last few years, that the lid has been lifted a little bit for me on this issue of materiality in the UK. And it certainly prompted some questions over there, and I'd be very interested, and it's such a hot topic in other areas. So for me, that's something that's really on my mind.
Norman?
Steve, first of all, thank you once again for everything you've done to support us and the groups and to organizing such a great meeting. I'm a charter member of this group, and I've been thinking just over the past 30 minutes or so as we were winding down the discussion of what a really interesting day this has been. And I think part of the reason it's been fascinating to me is that this may be the first time I think that all of the working group topics, I mean, there's a silver thread here that kind of ties everything together and touches on some big issues that I think would warrant our continuing attention going forward. So I think my short answer is, in addition to new topics we may take up for next year, I think we need to revisit some of these perhaps as a group, because think about what we've talked about today. We've talked about potentially significant changes to the scope and the business model of an audit. Building a framework around non-GAAP financial measures, reporting on CAMs, an expanded reporting model, which we're about to see your final handiwork on, and we'll have a year of experience under our belt by next year in terms of how that has developed, or what the reaction has been. Some of these changes would be market-driven, others are regulatory. But we then also talked today about doing a better job of measuring the quality of what may be expanded or differently structured audits going forward through AQIs and increased reporting in transparency reports around the results of internal audit quality reviews and as well as external ones that the firms engage in. Now, once we do a better job of measuring it, it will be easier for investors to attach greater significance and value to it, and therefore for them and for the ultimate customer to be willing to pay more for it, as Bob noted a few minutes ago, which is really what got me thinking about all this. And once there is greater market value to this product or this service, there may be opportunities to reward those who provide the best service, both at a firm level through increased fees, to the point the judge and others have made about the value of the brand, if you will, as well as possibly through, this would be nothing for this group to consider, but perhaps through some changes to compensation models in firms where high-performing individuals and groups could be incentivized and rewarded on the basis of good outcomes. Not good outcomes in the sense of a clean audit, but good outcomes in terms of external objective measures of audit quality. And that in turn will attract better talent and address the issue we talked about in the last group about what to do about young people who may have some reluctance now to consider the audit profession because it doesn't have the same appeal or glamour or even near medium-term compensation potential. This may be, these factors aligning may get us to a solution or the beginnings of a solution to that. So I really think there's been a fascinating convergence of topics. I think they're all part of an integrated set of issues around the business model of the profession. And I would urge that we, in some form, take it up again next year.
Thank you. Anne?
Yes, I'd like to echo the thanks to our founder, Steve. It's been a fascinating day. Three thoughts have caught me during the discussions. The first is this issue of audit firm governance. So much that we understand about corporate performance flows from understanding governance ideas like independent oversight, transparency. And if audit quality is our goal, then I do feel the governance path needs to be trodden. And looking at some international examples or picking that up in a deeper discussion would, to me, be very helpful. Because in the US, you only, in most or many companies, have the right for shareholders to ratify, but we could strengthen that line of accountability to the corporate owners and strengthen that sharper sense of who you're working for. And so that's one thought. The other is, and perhaps Norman expressed it well, about the scope of the audit, and I'm thinking about these new reporting, into which bucket I put the two parts of our working group, which is the non-GAAP stuff, but also the IFRS world and the whole bundle of new issues coming through around sustainability, or externalities is the unifying theme for us. And then in terms of the human capital side of the ACAP report, it seems to me that this question about diversity and talent management is critical, because diversity on corporate boards, we have terrific evidence that it's really good for decision making, both on risk and also on value. And as we look at more dimensions of diversity, from gender to race, ethnicity, disability, sexual orientation, in other words, anything, you're not only capturing better talent because you've broadened and deepened your pool to go and look for people, but you also then get a much higher quality of input because people come from different perspectives. So it seems to me that that would be maybe a complement to looking at the audit firm governance. But I also like very much Sarah's point about materiality, which I do think is a unifying theme through all of this. But materiality, we would want to hold on to it, you know, through the eyes of the beholder, which is, of course, the investor. We don't want that to be thought of in a more diminished way as just an issuer consideration. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Ann. Mike?
First, I'd like to thank you, Steve, and the rest of the board for allowing me an opportunity to serve. I found today just fascinating and frankly invigorating, just finding out some of the things that you're trying to do and have been doing in the past. As it relates to new ideas and topics of discussion, from my perspective, I actually would like to continue a focus on the non-GAAP accounting. I think that's pretty critical from my perspective, and I think from all investors' perspective. I think if accountants can put a value and definition on derivatives, they can very clearly define something as simple as EBITDA in particular industries. And I think that non-GAAP component and issue sort of leads to valuation. So I think they're sort of connected to the hip because many investors use a lot of non-GAAP items for valuation purposes. The second item is that of human capital. As I mentioned, I have a sincere interest in helping out in any way I can. I think it's very important to try and demonstrate and illustrate to those in college and graduate school the importance of the audit process, the value that you're bringing, and I think that this body can, working with the profession, can come up with something that makes sense and accomplishes that goal. I also like to help as much as I can on the issue of diversity. Thank you again.
Thank you. Kurt?
Thanks, Steve. And I'd like to compliment the board on really everything you guys have been doing. I think if you look back, really just as Chairman Doty said at the beginning, you know, over the course of the PCAOB's existence, the improvement in audit quality over that time period has been very good. And so we should not ever lose sight of really kind of that collective work. In terms of thoughts on what we should be looking at, I'm going to put this out as a very standard item, but it may not be, you know, in your direct purview of scope. And I have clearly no expectation that we'll solve it, but a lot of these things have a long tail and we got to get started on it. So cybersecurity, business continuity, and disaster recovery. Those are areas that are ripe for assurance. There's no easy answers. There are other, you know, organizations that are working on products and the like, but those are real threats, real issues that we need to provide help to the profession, the community, the preparer community, and it's clearly in the mindset of investors. So thank you.
I'm smiling because I brought up the issue of cybersecurity maybe 3 or 4 years ago in terms of what's the role of the auditor vis-a-vis assurance on cybersecurity. So I would welcome any thoughts because I think that the general sense that I get from the profession is that things are fine as is, and if they're not...
I think it's a really hard issue. I think that the talent that you have can bring some fresh ideas, and as long as we kind of view it as one of these things that we'll probably talk about for several years, that's helpful.
Thanks, Steve. I agree with everything that's been said here so far. I'm not sure how you're going to handle all the work by the time you get around the table, though. We're going to have 19 different ideas of things for you guys to focus on. But I'll actually just reiterate one that has been talked about before, and spoke with Jay and Janet last night on this in terms of the audit committee outreach. The fact that I kind of view there should be a partnership there. I realize it's not directly in your purview, but with the PCAOB, you know, kind of governing the macro and setting the rules, but where the rubber meets the road is with audit committees. And Jeanette was kind enough to come and meet with ours at Lake Mason several years ago. I think there's a lot that can be learned. And a lot of audit committee members, while they're financial experts, aren't necessarily audit experts. And figuring out a way to, share learnings and best practices and strengthen the role of audit committees, I think will go a long way to helping in terms of quality audits.
Just one quick reaction that Pete, thank you, and I appreciate the invitations we get. I recently met with another group of a specific company audit committee, and very valuable for us. We learn a lot from those interactions, so appreciate that. Just one comment to follow up on something that I think, Norm, you might have been holding these reports out earlier relative to some of the firm transparency reports. Or I can't remember who was holding. I didn't see what you had, but the one thing that was sticking with me is the U.S. report you're referring to from that firm. There's a much lengthier report than that that I know I've seen. I just looked it up. It's more equivalent to the UK report, and so not perfect analogy, but there's much more out there for that particular firm you were holding up than what you had in your hand.
Tony?
In terms of things that we might want to consider for next year or so, I have seen a lot of material lately on blockchain technology, the issues that relate. Lael Brainerd has been talking about it and how that affects data that the Federal Reserve for the banking system is affected by. But if you combine that information with, say, data analytics, the artificial intelligence, and how that's affecting audits today, because I know that some of the audit firms are already starting to look into the real-time auditing, as they like to call it. Deloitte is one of them. And so these are the kinds of things, and obviously it's a very, very large issue, very big issue, but I think we ought to start thinking about it, because it certainly affects the way financial analysis is being done and will be done tomorrow. My second thought is to go back and take another look. This is along the lines of what Norman said. The way I was looking at it was sort of like the post-implementation reviews that the FASB and the IASB have been conducting, except there are times when I wish they would actually read what those post-implementation reviews are telling them. But at the same time, I think we might want to do a little bit of that as well, and see if we can then look at it from that perspective. And the last point is audit committees. Pete just pointed out that they may be financial experts, but they're not necessarily audit experts. Some time back, I think Lynn had pointed out something about that requirement for accounting literacy that was accounting literate people that we needed, and how much that had been watered down. I was wondering if one could just go back and take a look at a good sample of audit committees and find out and rank them according to their accounting or financial literacy. It might be a service we might be able to provide. So if I do start that business, I probably won't be here. But in any case, jokes aside, I really do think that we need to take a look at blockchain, artificial intelligence, and how that's going to affect it. And last, I wanted to say that I appreciate the opportunity to talk about non-GAAP measures, and I don't know how I would be able to sufficiently thank you for the help I got from both you, from Nina, and from you. So I do appreciate that a great deal. Thanks.
I must say that I've heard exactly the same thing as you have with respect to the role and relevance of blockchain and how it might impact the audit of the future. I don't pretend to understand it. I haven't spoken to too many people who do understand it, but it's clearly coming, and it's clearly going to change the audit. And so I would welcome your thinking on that, and whether we take it up next year or at some point in the future, it's coming. Amy?
Thank you. I guess first off, I just wanted to really express my gratitude to you, Steve, and also just to be part of the group and the conversation. It's been an incredible learning opportunity for me today and throughout the time I've been on the group. I think, Sarah mentioned it earlier, that as investors, I think we maybe take a lot of this information for granted, and so just being here today has been an incredible opportunity, experience, and learning process for me, so I'm grateful for that. I think a lot of the information that people have suggested we continue to study is relevant, and I look forward to those discussions. Some areas that I'd like to call out and echo include materiality. And I think that because I'm new to the group, it's definitely been spoken of before. So it may be a repeat for a lot of you, but to some of the newer members, it might be very relevant. And then Tony just talked about something quite interesting that I hadn't even considered with blockchain and AI. And I think BlackRock is doing a lot with AI. So I'll be interested in Kevin's input into that, into the investment process. But I think that could be an area of increasing investor interest, which could benefit from audit oversight potentially. So those could be some areas of interest for me. And then I think the discussion of non-GAAP and also integrated reporting could be continued as well. I think we had a lot of interest there and a lot of good information discussed.
Kevin?
Thank you.
First of all, I'd also like to thank the board for the opportunity to actually work with Steve again, or work for Steve, as the case may be, from time to time. A couple of observations and then a recommendation. I was fascinated by the discussion, frankly, about the industry and the business model of the audit practice in firms, and it strikes me as a very similar conversation, sort of in the wake of the financial crisis, that the rating agency models have gone through in trying to understand their value, limit their liability. You know, both industries have the unique situation of having, frankly, been written into our securities laws. And so they are integral to the capital markets, but seem to struggle with how to make their value proposition reflect the product that they deliver, given the significance that they enjoy. And they seem to be struggling with a very similar conundrum. So, in terms of future-looking subjects, I would hearken back to a continuation of the non-GAAP accounting standards, particularly, though, as it related to the integrated reporting issue. I think as you look forward to new topics, it's important to be just that, forward-looking. And as, you know, sort of the ESG standards of disclosure continue to be an evolving issue amongst the, excuse me, with the SEC, I think it's important to look at what it means to provide assurances for those standards going forward, and whether it's in the traditional accounting model or there are other validators or other sources of assurances, I think is a topic worthy of additional conversation. And then, as a host of others have now touched upon, the issues that technology brings to the fore, so cybersecurity, blockchain, and the implications of even the deployment of fintech going forward, I think is an interesting topic for exploration going forward.
Thank you, Kevin. Linda?
Thank you. I must say it was certainly fascinating for me as well, so I really enjoyed it, and thank you for inviting me. I think my comments are very similar to what a lot of people have said. I don't think any of the issues we discussed today have been put to bed. I think there's still a lot of work on most of them. For me, a couple of them, obviously, the non-GAAP measures, I think, are really important, but the one that just really hit home for me is just drilling a little bit deeper into the governance of the firms. It is such an overarching issue, the governance of the firm, the transparency of the firms, the whole business model of the firms. I think to do justice to that, there's probably quite a bit of homework to be done to get the right information to really understand how it works and what underlies all of that. But I think that is also in the long term key to the survival and the thriving of the profession, because as the world is changing, if the auditing profession is not going to change in accordance, I think we're going to be in trouble. So I think that on the one hand, governance, transparency, and on the other hand, audit quality, and audit quality is actually such a big topic, should also stay on the agenda. If I think about audit quality, I think it was Norman that referred to the inspection findings and understanding that, or maybe it was Joe. And part of audit quality is also the skills. The skills of if we talk about human capital, the skills that auditors need going forward, the skills that auditors need in dealing with simple things as accounting estimates, but also with all of these new complex topics that are coming up. So I do think audit quality is important, and you can't really de-link these topics from one another. And then obviously the upcoming aspects, that was, I had similar thoughts to Tony. I think the things, for example, like big data, data analytics, all of these upcoming topics that will again change the business model and the way in which auditors will be auditing in future, away from sampling, probably do more real-time audit, more complete populations and so on. I think those things we must keep an eye on. So you probably will have more than enough, Steve, to fill your agenda.
Bob?
Yes, thank you, Steve, and thank you for your leadership here. And I also want to say to the board, I've been watching your work for, since 2002, I guess. It's you need to be commended, because we're not really talking about bad audits much anymore. And I was just one of your recent subjects. You inspected a company where I serve as chair of the audit committee, and I got to talk to your inspectors about what we do. So it was a good experience, and they're doing a good job. I want to reemphasize a couple things. One is what we're talking about, and I'd ask any investor in the room. Investors invest in managements, and a lot of what we talked about today was how to help management display their own credibility and capability by having it, in essence, independently assessed. The pass-fail audit report doesn't help them much in that independent assessment. But certainly one that talks about their judgments would help with that independent assessment. So I think if one looks at it with an open mind, it helps the auditing professions, and it also helps their clients to be perceived with more credibility in the marketplace. And then I'll just endorse I think a good topic for this group would be the changing technology environment. Not just how it might impact how auditors do their work, but also how investors digest financial information and the connectivity between the auditor and the investor in that technology exchange. The idea of only exchanging information as a whole is probably an obsolete model, because investors don't digest financial information as a whole. They digest it in bits, and we could find a way to get connectivity between the user and the auditor in that environment.
Thanks, Bob. Gary?
Yeah, this has been the best meeting that we've had so far, in my opinion, that I've seen. And so I was trying to figure out why that was the case, and I think the topics have been really good. But we also have a different mix, and we're getting a lot more of what's going on internationally. And I think we can learn a ton from the different viewpoints. And so I encourage us all to continue to reach out to wherever good ideas are coming from. I think I'd like to kind of lean against what we've talked about a lot of the time here today, and I'd like to see a simplification of the financial reporting process. I dream of the one-page annual report. I think that would give us a lot more free time, but I do think that there is some progress that can be made in terms of simplifying what investors have to read. I want all the disclosures that we've got and everything else, but I think that somehow we should go through and figure out how to make it as simple as possible. So, but thanks for having me.
Well, thank you, and thank you for that comment about the international participation. I think we can learn a lot from our international counterparts, and so we appreciate their input. Parveen?
Steve, I'd like to thank you and the other board members also. This was my first meeting, so I really enjoyed it a lot, and thank you for the opportunity to be a co-lead on one of the topics. So it was a tremendous learning experience for me. One of the topics that come to my mind that maybe worthy of consideration is in the area of internal control. And I know internal control over financial reporting continues to remain a challenge. But I guess what I'm thinking in that area is as follows. Currently, management uses the COSO framework to opine against the efficacy of their control systems, and then auditors also use the same framework to render an opinion. But at the same time, you also have auditing standard number 5, where absence of a material weakness leads one to conclude the control systems over financial reporting are effective. But when you look at the COSO framework, there are 5 elements, and whatever little research I have done in that area, I understand that folks are evaluating individually each one of those 5 components, control environment, control activities, risk assessment, monitoring, and information and communication. I wonder, do the investors understand that how the existence of that framework, how it is being employed by the management, and the use of the framework by the auditors, and concurrently the existence of AS5 criteria with regard to presence or absence of a material weakness, how does that interplay and impact the ultimate conclusion that comes on internal control over financial reporting, whether the company has a effective system or not an effective system? It ties into the audit quality, because when we talk about the audit quality under the current regime, we are looking at not only at the process that leads to the final product, we also look at the final product. So I think it's important to maybe think that how internal control is being evaluated, implemented, and what's the role of these standards in this area.
Thank you. And Mike?
The good thing about being this far down the path is that you can say, me too, me too, me too. The bad thing is then you always feel this pressure, do you need to come up with a new idea? I'm not going to come up with a new idea. But I think prospectively, from, again, an investor and especially a retail investor point of view, and how heavily they're utilizing or relying on the non-GAAP financial measures, I'd like to see us not let that drop to the side too far. I'd like to see, there was a lot of comments about potential enhancement on format and content of a combination of the financial statements and the footnotes that would allow you to readily see the non-GAAP financial measures within the financial statements and the supporting footnotes, and this netting and where do the numbers come from, and in conjunction with that, an audit framework and standards to audit against. I think there's a lot of value to the retail investor in that area, and I think we scratched the surface today, but I think it's a really, really important topic. And then the way retail investors do their investing today, and this whole big data, blockchain, cyber risk, data analytic, continuous auditing, all of that technology, I think that's a significant area of support, risk, help we could give the retail investors also in that area.
Larry?
I have the booby prize, but I've had this written since this morning, so I'm not copying anybody. I'm thankful for everybody. I've learned so much. Special thanks to Tony Sandy down at the end, who led our group. And I am strongly proposing non-GAAP Part 2 next year. I am, as useful as it is, I am both suspicious and concerned with its rapid spike in growth. Although I do believe that it might be because we live in a zero knowledge world, like knowledge is cheap, information is cheap, and perhaps that's part of it. I don't know. The cynical part of me could say, like, why are earnings adjustments always asymmetrical? Like, why? Why are exceptions so often not exceptional? Or how is it that management can define what the rules and get paid on those rules without any oversight or very limited oversight? That said, those aren't even the big issue. I mean, I think the big issue is that we have to realize that non-GAAP is probably here to stay and might even grow. And how can we better educate people, and how can we come up with some type of comparability, if there is any, or any kind of uniformity? If we start tomorrow, maybe we'll have some answers by next year, but I really do believe that that is the big issue. Thank you.
Thank you. And then, Brian, you and Wes have been, you certainly have been covering us and participating, Brian, from the initiation. And if either of you have comments that you'd like to make, we'd certainly welcome them. And if you'd also pass along our thanks to Chair White for her participation, that would be most appreciated.
Yeah, just for my part, having participated in these meetings now for 6 years, I do recognize the value and would just like to echo the remarks that Chair White made this morning. Certainly, you've covered a range of important topics, and I think a lot to think about coming out of the meeting today. I know that the PCAOB staff and SEC staff as well will utilize this information and really value the work that this group does and the contributions that you're making.
I'll be very brief. Much appreciation for all of the work of the committee, the group, in the dialogue, the discussion. It certainly informs the work that we do and that we do with the PCAOB. So we do appreciate that, as does Chair White and the other commissioners. So thank you very much. It's been a very productive day and discussion from my perspective.
And now, a very special thanks, first of all, to everybody here, but to our presenters. I agree with the chairman. I think, Tony, that your presentation on non-GAAP was extraordinarily well done and insightful, and certainly left a number of issues for both us and the SEC to consider. And I know, because I've been, as I said, part of the traffic, that putting that together really was a yeoman's effort. So for you and your entire team, compliments. Thank you, Parveen, for keeping our feet to the fire with respect to the ACAP recommendations. I'm a terrific supporter of the ACAP recommendations. And if you could thank Lynn in absence, and to your entire working group, I would appreciate that. But I thought your presentation was excellent as well. Joe has left, but I want to thank the empty chair for his 8 years worth of his participation on this issue, which is hopefully coming to a final point. And Sarah, for all your work in the UK, for your participation here today, for your presentation. Thank you very much. It's well worth it to us. And the same goes for you, Linda, from traveling from South Africa. It's been a significant contribution. And in conclusion, these meetings could not take place without Nina Majuri-Assad and Tope Falarin. So Nina and Tope, who are over here, both substantively, administratively, every single aspect of this. It's a three-person effort, and I want to really give you, all the credit in the world which you deserve. So thank you very much. And with that, I hope to see you next year.